everyone, this is Carrie Cassidy, and we are about to start. I'm sorry for the delay. It's always a problem starting with the logistics and getting the video to work simultaneously with everything else. So if you just bear with me, we'll get this going. I appreciate your patience. So hold on one moment. Wild and crazy. So how you doing, Keith? We are live right now, just so you know.
All right.
And I'm actually in the process of getting this thing to work, but I don't know. It's acting kind of weird. All right.
I can only see you on audio. I don't know.
I know.
Just have an image of you.
It's just, well, I don't know how to make this work, so I'm just not even going to try at this moment. I don't know what to do. It's always like that. It just does this weird thing. Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot. We're here with Keith Hunter, and we're going to be talking about earth changes, Haarp, and consciousness. And Keith is the author of The Lost Age of High Knowledge. How about that? I remembered the title of your book. And showing it on the screen. Okay, that's great. And we do have a chat room along with this this presentation so that you can ask your questions. All I ask is if you would put them in caps, please. And so at this moment, Keith, first of all, how are you doing?
Not too bad. Not too bad.
Okay, well, you guys made it. You made it through the Olympics, huh?
Yes. No false flag operation.
There you go. Yeah.
And we won lots of golds. I don't think anybody's been done for drugs on our team either, so can't go wrong, really.
Okay, a little patriotism, I guess. Anyway, so at the moment, you know, we've got a lot going on, and I'm going to try to pull up the seismic indicators so that people can also see what's going on with the earthquakes this morning. I know that we had a super large one. You probably know, I don't know how to pronounce the area of the sea, but it's something like Onhotska or something. Sea, it's actually in between Russia and Japan, but closer to Japan and the Kamchatka region where there are sort of a set of volcanoes, I think at least 3. And so somebody just put this link into the chat. I don't know if it's going to work that way, but
I've seen the one... 7.7, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, but
2 days ago.
Right, that's correct. But at this moment, what you have to do is you actually have to add 1 point because they downgraded the entire whatever you call that USGS, the magnitudes. I've gotten this from several sources who seem to know exactly what they're talking about. So, so if you look at that, you can actually see that it is an 8-pointer.
When you say the downgrading, you're not talking about the difference between the Richter scale and the moment magnetic scale. You're literally saying that they are fudging the results and literally recording them up as one.
Yeah, that is exactly what I'm saying.
Right. No.
Okay. Actually, I don't know why I'm not getting the seismic IRS EDU. Is that what it is? Shoot.
I've got the Australian database open and also USGS. Well, got the USGS open for another reason, but that's where I'm getting it from.
Okay.
They actually cite the USGS for this particular earthquake.
Okay, well that's interesting. But if you take a look at it, it's much bigger than anywhere else
Oh yeah, yeah.
on the entire world map, which is substantial. So wherever you want to take that. So at this point, Keith, what do you have to say about what's going on, and what's your take on, well, everything? But let's start out with the earthquakes and how you're sort of seeing it.
Well, as far as the seismic stuff goes, I did a bit of an analysis of, as I say, the Iranian earthquake, and I think that one was of interest. Well, I say it was a bit of a cluster, but there were two earthquakes in particular. One about 6.3, another one about 6.4, and the latitudes of the earthquakes were practically dead on the same latitude as the Japanese earthquake that occurred March the 11th, 2011, last year. That was the 9.01. And I mean, I did an analysis of that in some detail on one of my YouTube videos about earthquake predictions and how it's tied into essentially the positions of the planets and the sun and the moon. And there are certain arc lengths of separation between the epicenter points of earthquakes and the positions of various celestial bodies. If the very moment an earthquake is registered, like on these databases, they are listed at universal time in terms of the date, the hour, right down to the nearest second, right, when they're registered. And if you plug that information into an astronomical database and you essentially freeze the solar system and freeze the rotation of the Earth at that moment, you can essentially draw a straight line between the center of the Earth and the center of another body like the sun. And that line pierces through the surface of the Earth. So you have a ground position of coordinates for the celestial body in question. And what you tend to find is that the arc lengths over the surface of the ellipsoid Earth, not angular measures, but arc lengths that connect up those ground positions of various bodies to the epicenter points, appear to have significance in that sometimes they fit within the Earth a whole number of times, indicating a resonant fit, which is why the earthquake was triggered and occurred on that precise point. And other times they're more subtle musical frequencies and ratios. And with respect then to the Japanese earthquake and how that ties into the Iranian earthquake, well, you can also find that because the Earth's rotating on its axis, it's got a natural axis point, polar point, and an equator point, and it's almost like an amplitude point to the equator of the Earth. And not only do you find that the arc lengths that connect up the epicenter points to the ground positions of celestial bodies are significant, you also get significant latitude values, either north or south, from the equator up to or into the southern equator, say, connecting up to where the epicenter point is. So the pure latitude of the Japanese earthquake, though, was 38.322 degrees north of the equator. And that was, say, March the 11th. And what that gives you in terms of a fit is it fits in ratio-wise. Well, the ratio is, if you take, in this case, the polar circumference of the Earth, complete elliptical circumference of the Earth, and take that value and divide by the latitude value from the equator up to that Japanese one. The ratio between them is practically dead on 66 divided by 7 as a ratio. And again, it's just one of the ratios going that, in terms of the Japanese earthquake specifically, the arc length connecting up the earthquake epicenter to the sun ground position, that arc length fits into the equator of the Earth practically dead on 6 times, a whole number. And this is where the resonance effect, you see, if you've got a waveform that impinges upon a material object, a physical object, if the wavelength of the waveform, and you know how we usually model them in terms of peaks and troughs, so peak to peak or trough to trough, if that wavelength fits in to the dimensions of the physical object it impinges upon, you end up with an internal reflection of the wave. It becomes trapped within it and sets up a frozen standing wave pattern because there is a harmonic fit. and this throws the target object into an agitated state. It starts to shake. And this is why, when you look at earthquakes, you'll tend to have the positions of the sun and the moon, they'll be in special patterns. And this really is split-second timing. You'll find that you have error rates of just 1 or 2 seconds, maybe, or so, in terms of these fits of the arc lengths connecting up and fitting into the Earth, or even of ratios connecting up, a combination of arc lengths. You can have an earthquake which might have the sun, the moon, it might have Venus, all contributing bodies, and the arc lengths that play out over the surface of the Earth essentially might have musical ratios of 2 to 3, and or more complex ones, 25 to 17, or things like that. There'll be a very subtle pattern. This is why it's very difficult to really get to the heart of modelling them. But in the case of the Iranian earthquake, then the pure latitude value of the one just recently, and this is it was near the Tabrit region, and it was the precise date. It was the 11th of August, so it was just a few days ago now. And it was 38.322 degrees, the same latitude. So you've got the same kind of harmonic significance. And there was one that followed on from that, literally just about 12 or 13 minutes later, same latitude, but several miles away, just staggered slightly. And then we get a cluster of them. I know there's a lot of talk lately, in particular, about Iran being invaded by Israel and the US together. And it has definitely come across my mind that earthquakes as a weapon may well be used as part of that. And I don't know whether you've heard this particular story, Kerry. It's one that I've not been able to really find much sources on, except maybe 1 or 2. But when Libya was last year, when they were actually really overthrowing the country, there was a reported cover-up of an 8.4 magnitude earthquake. And that occurred, according to this particular source here, it was on the 19th of May 2011. And it was near the coast, and again, 8.4. There's a few sources put that out. I really am still in two minds as to whether the sources are legitimate in this sense, but they give lots of data readouts for the subtle, the whole thing, if you will. So it looks like maybe somebody captured a screenshot from a database before it was taken down, but it wouldn't strike me that earthquakes would be used as weapons. I mean, the power of them is phenomenal. It is absolutely devastating. And Iran itself, I'd have to check the records, but I believe they've had earthquakes going back a few decades now, where there were tens of thousands of people killed all in one go with an earthquake near Tehran, that kind of region. So, I even looked at the possibility, actually, of the Straits of Hormuz and closing them with nuclear weapons. And I did an evaluation of the latitude point, just the pure latitude of where the Straits of Hormuz was. I'd have to redo the calculations, but it seemed favourable and in line with various other latitudes and measures associated with nuclear weapons tests that we know about. So I think that it'd be very interesting to see. But in a way, when we look at that event, these are like just strange last-minute throws of the dice, because I think what we're really looking at, Kerry, are these great earth changes, and it's the the end of age. Dare we say that? And I mean,
okay. Well, before we go down that road, and I appreciate the reference because I know that it's beginning to look sort of like that at the moment, although I'm not completely convinced that that's the case. It is certainly the end of something, and I guess you could call it the end of an age, but it's certainly not the end of this world as we know it completely. It doesn't seem. I think to some degree there's a lot more kind of panic over what we see than there is sort of maybe adding 2 and 2 together to see what's going on. So that if you've got a government that's creating, for example, earthquakes in places, taking advantage of what you are talking about, which is how would you term it? Would you? I mean, are you sort of referencing the combination of ley lines and hyperdimensional physics, or you know what I'm saying? What?
I think I see what you're saying. I know that some theorists and especially when you talk about ley lines, they are looking at the like a fixed grid upon the Earth, and you'll have heard of the platonic solids,
Right.
the various geometrical shapes, and there are some grid patterns like David Hatcher Childress. He wrote a book, and the anti-gravity in the world grid, and he looked at various models that certain scientists seem to have found, and what I tend to find myself. I have not found any geophysical structures like, say, megalithic monuments, or even advanced facilities like the Pine Gap US base or Menwith Hill. I do not find, when I look at these particular bases, that they are tied into fixed points in a geometrical system that seems to be built into our Earth as such. What I seem to find is that they are using the Earth form, and they are selecting locations. For example, the Great Pyramid, the latitude placement appears to be based on a ratio which is 10 times the difference between what is the current Earth tropical year, just over 365 days. It's 365.24218. If you divide that by 360, and the ancient Egyptians, believe that, and I too believe it was a reality that the Earth did once have 360 days per year. Well, that ratio between them is about 10.14. It seems to be that ratio defined where they positioned the latitude of the Great Pyramid in terms of the small circle circumference of the Earth at that latitude, which is about 29 degrees 58 minutes 51 seconds north. The small circle circumference there, divided just by the pure latitude arc, as I said, they are significant in their own right, the pure latitude from the equator to there. So they feel, they seem to be fitting, various structures in very precise ways with ratios tied into the planet. And another big one is the connection between Menwith Hill and Pine Gap. These are these signals intelligence bases part of the echelon matrix. Pine Gap is almost located dead centre in Australia itself, the physical landmass of Australia, near Alice Springs, I believe. And Menwith Hill is located here in England, just north of me, somewhere about 20 miles north or so, North Yorkshire. And again, if you use a very advanced Earth ellipsoid model, right, the WGS-84 model, World Geodetic System, it was in 1984, the arc length that connects up both those sites directly as a great circle arc over the Earth, over our advanced model, it has got a fixed ratio, right? It is precisely as a fraction. It's 3/8 of the Earth's equatorial circumference, right? So if you took the Earth's equatorial circumference, divide by 8, and then multiply by 3, you get that very same arc length distance between these two sites, and it's literally, we're talking error rates of several hundred feet. In the case of these two facilities, the buildings are so massive, the error rate is contained within the buildings. So it seems to me that what you're getting at, the objects seem to be sighted in very subtle ways, and they do not seem to be based upon a fixed grid on the Earth in terms of some sort of platonic solids or some kind of patterns like that. I don't see that kind of complexity. I think that they use ratios that connect up sites which are like a harmonic fit or a musical fit to the Earth itself and certain key dimensions. And this is because I believe it's tied into the physics of these facilities and what they're able to achieve. In terms of using the Earth itself, they can cause a resonant agitation. They can use the Earth as a transmitter, and in the way in which these sites, in some advanced respects, I believe that they are tied in to some of the effects, the exotic effects of nuclear weapons, where you can transmit nuclear explosions literally through space, instantaneously, or through time.
Okay, but what you're talking about, aren't you also talking about some kind of intersection of ley lines or other kinds of energy lines where, like, I guess it was Bruce Cathy who talked about that, where there, in a sense, a portal is caused by the intersection of these energy lines.
Yes, in one of his books, actually, he was in contact with somebody about some of his theories that because he looked at the Earth's magnetic fields and he found that there were two of them and they were offset from one another and there was like a crossing point of these. And I did in my book, I actually evaluated the field lines of these that he gives, and it was a major breakthrough for me in actually showing how the densities of the different magnetic fields are transformed relative to just a subtle change in the Earth's orbital period. But when he speaks about these magnetic lines crossing, he put forward the theory that this is where they create whirlpools of matter, and then this is what is part of our planet being formed. Cathy did in his book. He came up with a basic grid system initially of a north, south, east, west, just cross lines at 7.5 minutes of arc intervals. And he came up with this system because he was looking at the observed flight patterns of UFOs. And he would look in all the reports. If you've got like a body in the sky moving around and multiple witnesses see it, they could give a kind of and he could directionally find it on a map. He was finding that they seemed to be sighted, and he could draw straight lines, and they were crisscrossing. And this is, again, he put forward the theory that they are in some way using the Earth and using a grid, a natural grid. I don't know whether it's essentially natural. I just wonder whether or not the craft themselves are making use of the Earth's dimensions, and it's a combination of their technical interaction with this in an energetic sense, but also like in a musical sense. I'm a bit wary of some of the grid patterns I see that seem to connect up the megalithic monuments like the Platonic solids. I don't necessarily think that the lines that they talk of there are, quote, real. I think that there may well be real natural lines, but I think, as I said, that the evidence I've got from evaluating military facilities and megalithic monuments suggests to me that they look for special ratios to define the locations of these sites.
Okay, but well, I appreciate that. So, but what I would say is that it seems to me that they're using more. I mean, I'm not sure why you're saying sort of the Platonic solid idea or whatever in terms of the geometry of Earth. If you look at it as a whole, it does seem like they are using it in that sense. In other words, not as we're seeing just flat on the surface. That's one thing. And the other thing is that they do seem to be using the grid lines on some level. In other words, the Michael and Mary lines, for example, that go through England and go through the various, Stonehenge and various monuments there. Dowsers can go to those lines, and I've seen them do it, and I've also myself done it because I can feel energy in my hands, and there is definite energy along those lines. In other words, patterns of energy that coalesces along those lines in a certain way. And if you get an intersection of those lines, you often get, well, for one thing, a stone put there to sort of capture the energy or do something with the energy, and so on.
I would say that I can connect up Stonehenge even to the Great Pyramids. I do believe that is a very important site, and again, you can show special ratios globally as to where that was positioned. I think what I'm really saying is those specific lines that you found there. I'm not aware of any global pattern, if you will. And I mentioned the Platonic solids because that is one theory put forward as a global pattern. And some people have said that the lines that connect up the vertex points of these shapes, cubes, icosahedrons, they seem to suggest that they connect up certain megalithic monuments. And my own work seems to suggest that that's false. And so
okay, how do you prove it false, though? Because I think, I think David Wilcock is basing his information on other work out there, but they are talking about that. They are talking about the dodecahedron and so on, And I don't know how you're relating all this to, for example, Richard Hoagland's 19.5, where he
Oh,
sees the placement of the face on Mars, which is at the same place. In other words, the Great Pyramid was put in relationship to, supposedly the stars of Orion. There's some discussion as to whether it also lines up with Sirius and so on, and then also the placement in relative to 19.5.
when it comes to the, I will throw this one in. There was an article, and it was by Russian scientists in the 1950s, and it was entitled something like, "Is the Earth a Giant Crystal?" And I believe what they found was, and I think it was a combination of an icosahedron and a dodecahedron. They're like, one's a 20-sided shape, the other one's a 12-sided shape, and they fit together because of the vertex points. And they were looking at various impressions and so forth in the physical geometry of the Earth, and I think that's why they were coming across that. And the only thing I'm saying is, when you say proving it false, I'd say when I evaluate the positions of some of the most prominent monuments, like Stonehenge, like the Great Pyramid, and even like some of these modern-day military facilities of great prominence, and I look at them and evaluate them in accordance with our most advanced Earth ellipsoid model, the ratios that you get are of such precision, right, in connecting up the sites to one another and to the Earth. They're a basic musical set. For me, it kind of blows me away. These are what I would say are decisive connections, and they tell me that these ratios are the defining characteristics as to where they placed these monuments. And it's not necessarily a case that they were looking for a natural pattern of lines as such. I think that there may be natural patterns, but I've just not seen one.
I see where you're going with that. But, that has to do with the military installations, right?
In part, they're even integrated. They seem to be placed with the same considerations as the megalithic monuments.
Okay, but are you saying that you think, for example, the pyramids of Giza, you're only looking at the ratio? You're not looking, because again, I still have to say that there seems to be a direct correlation between the face on Mars and the placement of the Great Pyramid and the other pyramids.
Well, in my book, Catherine, you'll be able to look this one up. I didn't look at the face on Mars, because to me that's more of an artistic structure. But you know the D&M pyramid, the 5-sided one, because that is a geometric structure, and I do believe the Great Pyramid here on Earth is a machine, a device, and it is built to interact in a resonant way. And remember I said that latitude arcs are significant in their own right. Well, if you take the base of the Great Pyramid, which is about 756 feet, well, the arc length from the equator to the latitude of where it's placed, it fits in practically dead on 14,400 times. And you'll also see the connections like that Robert Temple mentions about 144,000 casing stones. And even Bruce Cathey also talks about the ancients measuring light speed in terms of units of 144,000 minutes of arc per 8/9 of a second. This is a system he came up with. So I think the physical structure was built to the size it was because of the latitude displacement in combination with that defining ratio of small circle circumference divided by the arc latitude. Now, I found when I did an evaluation of the latitude placement of the D&M pyramid on Mars, right? There was a ratio, a great ratio there, and it was actually because it's at about 40.893 degrees north of the Martian equator, and the ratio is between the equatorial circumference of Mars and small circle circumference of Mars at that latitude, 40.893. And if you do division sum, small circle divided by equator, you get 0.72. As a calculation, it's something like 0.71999, and then a few other numbers. It's very exacting, and again, it tells me that, and again, 0.72, if you multiply that by 2, you got 1.44. So I believe that is another energetic structure on Mars, a 5-sided pyramid, and you can even have times to such as the Great Pyramid as well. I think that these could be a network of devices for communication purposes, or even, dare I say, teleportation purposes between different celestial bodies, and that you have to place them at certain locations in order to tap into the natural harmonies and energetic harmonies associated with those celestial bodies. So you've got to fit them carefully, but I believe that you can get connections between different facilities, if you will, on different bodies. So I've not looked at the face of Master Bush because it comes across as more of an artistic structure, but the five-sided pyramid, I think, is, again, if you evaluate it,
Okay, but well, let me just say, on an intuitive level, I wouldn't sell the face on Mars short, so to speak, in that way. So I would encourage you to maybe do your calculations on that, because it may be, it may be a sort of an attractive covering to something that is underneath it, which is very much involved in things like possibly teleportation, etc. It's just an intuitive take. Okay, well, that's very interesting. So, and I agree with you, because there's a lot of evidence to indicate that the Great Pyramid, or pyramids in general, are sort of teleportation devices, or in the case of the Great Pyramid, it is called to, as an ascension chamber. And so this is, this is something that is worth investigating. And I have another person who's written a book called We the Scythians. I don't know if you've heard of this person. I think his name is David Ritchie, if I have the right name. Anyway, he's a somewhat obscure author, but I think he lives in England at this point. And he's written a fascinating book all about what the pyramid really was used for, and says that it's never been in the public domain what its true purpose is, which is interesting. And he alludes to the idea that it is an ark. And I have another piece of evidence telling me that it may have been an ark. And I know that sounds kind of far-fetched, but all I can tell you is there seems to be some esoteric information that I've been given recently by a whistleblower that lends itself to that theory. So I don't know if you want to go down that line. Obviously, maybe that's a new idea to you, but you might think about that.
I've heard, I think, similar theories. I don't know whether I've got the guy right. Is it Tony Bushby, possibly? There's a few people who've looked at certain texts, and they too think that it was somehow built prior to a great disaster as a kind of a monument to store ancient knowledge. And that you wonder whether or not maybe the site's been appropriated. But I think when you look at some of the work of Graham Hancock, especially, and I think he said it himself when he was in the Grand Gallery section, and he's looking at all the grooves in the thing, both sides and everything. It looks like you've got internal machinery that would have been going up and down in that chamber, and it's like being decommissioned and all been taken out, and all you've got left is the stone, itself that remains. But there may well have been some high-tech stuff. One other thing I would just throw out there that has crossed my mind regarding the Great Pyramid, whether or not it's some sort of essentially like a terraforming device, an energetic terraforming device for the Earth to actually give us an environment which is more healthy, higher vibrations, that, if you want to at least generally put it in that way. That's definitely crossed my mind as a purpose for it as well. I mean, it almost reminds me that the film Aliens, where they had a terraforming type pyramid on it, if you know the movie in '86, it's something similar to that kind of thing.
Well, actually, I don't know if you know the work of Hugh Newman at all.
The name seems
well, the Megalithomania conferences.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, he's the researcher who organizes those. And he's actually going to be coming on my Egypt trip. But he's a dowser as well as a researcher. And one of the things he talks about, he actually has visited pyramids that are, some of the pyramids, like even in Bosnia and other places, where the land is starting to cover the pyramids, so it's kind of hidden in a certain way. But what he's noticed is, I think it's a theory, but the idea that earthquakes and earth movements are less around places that have pyramids. So it was a working theory at the time that I talked to him. I don't know if he's developed it further than that, but there seems to be some evidence to that effect, that it stabilizes the land, and in a similar way to the way you're talking about it. It could at the same time be sending out positive harmonics, so to speak, that are good for human health or for growing plants and so on. In other words, stabilizing and creating an environment that is conducive to even higher thought.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, so at this point, though, because our subject really is earth changes, what I was hoping you would do is kind of look at the situation, even with the sort of the renewed volcanism and the possible incoming body that may or may not be out there, and talk about that. I know that you sent me, you sent me this, I don't know what you call it, sort of a model.
Thing.
Well, a model, where we showed the possible trajectory of an incoming object based on information, and we don't have clear information at this time, but
yeah. I definitely see if I can explain that a bit better, because I know I sent it to you, but what I was looking at was this, right? And I'll just say a few brief things about an incoming body, and because what I was looking at was this. I was looking at what would be a plausible orbit for such a body. And if we're talking about an object which may well have been involved in disaster scenarios way back, we can point towards, say, about 12,000 years ago, and the Atlantis stories and the Great Devastation, and there's coming out of the Ice Age, and also all the mysteries associated with that. And I even sent you an article as well about some new studies that were finding possible meteor showers, evidence globally in various places, that occurred about 12,000 years ago. So I was saying to myself, well, 12,000 years, if that's a disaster scenario, and this is a body spoken of in various mythologies, that there would be a plausible orbital period, if you may, yeah? A 12,000 year orbital period. And if we were to again say, well, we'd expect it to come deep into the inner solar system, right? Somewhere around about near the Earth and Venus, I thought, well, why not halfway between Venus and the Earth, say? Now, the Earth, about 93 million miles from the Sun on average, and we call that 1 astronomical unit. Venus is about, I think, 0.72 astronomical units or so. So what I did was, I looked at what might be a plausible model for such an object. And I also looked at a few other things. You see, a lot of people out there have talked about our solar system being a binary system. And definitely, I believe that. About 70 to 80% of stars have binary companions. I have no problem believing that. But I think that the binary system theory, I think it really relates to a true partner star to our sun, which is probably several light years away from us. I know certain theories say it could be Sirius, and that's one of the theories put forward by the Sirius Research Group. But some people think that we may have a brown dwarf star coming into our solar system. My own reading of some of the science we've got and the mythologies that go back to ancient times tells me that we're not looking at an object which is necessarily massive, and it doesn't even need to be so, because I only believe that this object is associated with certain limited Earth changes of a certain type. And just to give you an example, the two outermost bodies in our solar system we'll be familiar with is the gas giant Neptune and then Pluto. Neptune orbits at about 30 astronomical units out, that the Earth is 1. Pluto's about 40. Pluto is about 90,000 days to orbit the Sun. Neptune's about 60,000. So there's like a 3-to-2 ratio between them. And we've got a particular study, it was in 1988, and it was by Jackson and Killen, if I've got the names right. And they actually ran simulations of test masses. And they said, what kind of incoming mass could come close to the solar system, right? And what mass would it need to be to disrupt this very stable 3-to-2 ratio between Pluto and Neptune? And they found that if an incoming body was to enter close to our solar system, close to these planets, on an inward trajectory, say, then it could not be greater than 5 Earth masses, right? If it's greater than 5 Earth masses, it would disrupt Pluto and Neptune, and that's been very stable for, I think, a few million years or so. So if we're going by the ancient mythologies, we want to say, right, this body would need to come in, but it could not wreck the orbits of the planets, right? Now, if you look at the work of, say, Robert Harrington and the US Naval Observatory, what is very interesting about his work, because he even had a sit-down with Sitchin in a documentary. I think he died in 1991.
Right.
Suspicious circumstances regarding his death. I believe it was some sudden cancer of the back or something. Very suspicious. I'd have to check the sources on that. But he had a bit of a sit down, and they were even on TV with Sitchin, and they were talking about some of Sitchin's theories. And they had these reports, and this is the US Naval Observatory. And I think it's what's his name? Is it Canny?
James McKinney?
That could be him, yeah. He was discussing quite recently on one of his own shows, if I got this right, this particular report, and even cited it. And he was saying how they've got some very detailed images of Uranus and Neptune's orbit being disturbed, right? And they were doing like a follow-up report on it. And he says, we don't need to do too much data in this report, because we know, and he was referring to another report, that the data is sound. And they actually came out with a mass of between 4 and 8 Earth masses, right?
Okay.
As to this body. So when you look at this, especially towards the lower end of 4, there was even a recent article, and this is one I sent you recently, Kerry. It made it in broadsheet headlines in Britain here, the hunt for Planet X still on. And there was a guy looking at the outer asteroid belt and doing a new evaluation. And he came up with a value of 4 Earth masses. So it seems to me that there's a body of evidence from very credible sources pointing towards a disruption or a discrepancy of about 4 Earth masses. And this is underneath this critical 5 Earth mass limit that this other seemingly independent study showed, yeah? We couldn't have it greater than that. So for me, if we're looking for a body, we're looking for a body which is underneath this 5 Earth mass threshold. And it will be then nowhere near a brown dwarf, because a brown dwarf star is about 13 Jupiter masses. And one Jupiter mass is 318 Earth masses. If such an object comes into the solar system, and I've seen simulations of this, it wipes out the orbits of the planets. It doesn't need to collide with them. The gravitational perturbations scatter the planets just all over the place.
Okay, but, okay, that's very interesting. So you're saying that a brown dwarf has to be this size? I mean, you're saying...
No. I'm saying it's not a brown dwarf at all.
No, I know, but you're saying if you're describing brown dwarfs, and you're saying brown dwarfs are 13 the size of Jupiter?
No, this is what conventional theorists will tell you about brown dwarfs. They are something like the next progression on from a large gas giant. Now, Jupiter, obviously, it's the largest gas giant in our solar system. It's 318 times the mass of the Earth, right?
I see.
318 Earth masses. Now, what the scientists tell you as a transition upwards from larger gas giants, the brown dwarf star, and this is, again, it's almost theoretical, but it's like an approximation, but they've got models on this, and they're saying, due to certain physics factors, the approximate range of a brown dwarf star begins at a lower limit of about 13 Jupiter masses, with an upper limit of about 80 Jupiter masses. So such a body, this is why I'm saying, if we do have a brown dwarf star as a binary companion, this would be, for me, a few light years away, and it wouldn't get that close. What we're looking for in terms of this exotic Planet X, if you will, coming into the solar system, I believe is a body which is a lot more like a comet in many respects, and it will be of a mass value less than 5 Earth masses, right? And I believe the orbital pattern of it will be one which is highly inclined to the solar system. In other words, all of the bodies in the solar system, all the planets, they all roughly have the same plane about the sun. They do differ at several degrees or so, but they're all roughly the same. Now, cometary bodies, they can cross through, right? If you've got a highly eccentric body coming from deep outside and it goes deep into the solar system, then that body would end up crossing through the orbits of the other planets if it were on the same plane, roughly. And so if you're going to have a stable configuration here, going back several million years, for example, right, then you'd think it would have hit the other planets or at least come close to be gravitationally perturbed, to be cast away. So if we're looking for a stable configuration, we'd have to say that the orbital plane of this highly eccentric body is tilted on its side. And this is one of the models that Robert Harrington came up with himself. He thought it to be about 32 and a half degrees or so inclined to the orbital planes of the other planets, so that it would safely go underneath, if you will, the solar system and then come out. I do know that the particular model he was looking at was only for about 1,018 years as an orbital period, and I don't think he even said it will get closer to Pluto. And I think this is where Sitchin and Harrington disagree a little bit. But Sitchin goes for a 3,600-year orbit. What you'll tend to find is, and I even evaluated, I did a couple of simulations myself looking at a 3,600-year orbit with the object coming close to the asteroid belt, which is Sitchin's basic model. Yeah, his model's there. I looked at a 12,000-year orbit where the closest approach was halfway between Venus and the Earth, highly inclined, and that's the model that I actually sent you, Kerry. And I even looked at comet Elenin just as an example, because Elenin as an incoming comet is hyperbolic. In other words, it has no closed orbital period. When it comes into the solar system, though, and it gets closest approach, and then comes out again. The thing about modelling these kinds of objects like this is, you will tend to find that the time periods to get from, say, the outer solar system, say from Pluto, deep to the inner solar system, they're very comparable for a 12,000-year orbit or even a 3,600-year orbit. And the orbit I sent you is this, because the reason why I did this study was to try to get people to understand something about a kind of timeline, if you will, or how close would such a body be, right?
Well, yeah, and that's very valuable. Can you show that model? Are you able to, or should I try to, show it?
No idea how to.
Okay, you would share your screen. There's a capability to share a screen on Skype. You know how to do that? It's just at the top in the menu. But I could also, I don't want to interrupt your flow here, but I think it would be valuable for people to see that model, right?
Right. I've got it on screen right now. I'll go to the start, and I'm now going to, let's see. You said there's a menu button. You said tools, is it?
Yeah, it'll be across the top on Skype. I believe that just says,
yeah. Okay, screen.
I don't know where it is. I know people do screen sharing all the time with me on Skype. Trying to think.
Actually.
Oh yeah, it says on mine. It's under conversations, but you probably don't use a Mac. But it says share screen. It's actually one of the items. There's several items there. Send SMS, send files, send contacts, and then share screen.
There's no share screen thing underneath my menu on that conversation.
Oh.
It says send profile image.
Do you have an older version of Skype? Maybe that's...
Okay. It's something I think you could post it as like an embedded YouTube thing. You could upload it to your channel, Kerry. It's a very, very small file. Or I could upload it to mine and just send you the favourites link. But
well, yeah. At this moment, I could try to find it quickly here. I know you did send it to me. I'm not sure how easy it is to find, but why don't you continue talking, and then in
Yeah.
the meanwhile, I will try to find it.
Well, what I was looking at then in terms of this model, and this is again, it definitely relates back to some of the work by Courtney Brown. This is what led me to really consider it. Some of the things he said, Kerry, in the that big like the 4-hour interview that you did with him. And I thought that was a brilliant interview, and I definitely recommend that. I think he was very articulate. I know part of it's gone on radio, but when he was going through all the images on the screen, the remote viewers had directly actually come up with, I thought that was great. Because in that remote viewing experiment then, I don't want to go into all the details too much, but basically he compared 2008 to a date of June the 1st, 2013. And he was looking at two possible timelines, timeline A and timeline B, on this 2013 date. One, he was looking at, did the scientists of the world admit to the existence of remote viewing? And the other one was, were they still denying it? And there were various sites around the world, I think about 7 or 8 or so, like Key West in Florida, the Sydney Opera House, somewhere near Mount Kilimanjaro, Hawaii. And they were basically looking to see if there were significant water, like climate change on these particular areas and so forth. Some of them were very low to the ground and that. And basically what he found was that out of, I think there were like 40 different sessions or something, there were like global disaster type events going in, I think it was 20 out of 40 for one timeline and about 17 out of 40, or it might be out of 38, but almost half of them. And when you looked at comparing both of those to what happened in 2008, the remote viewers for 2008 found business as usual. Everybody's happy, no disasters or anything. And one of the things that the remote viewers seemed to be coming up with, and they were even drawing some of these images that you reproduced and you talked through, Kerry, in the interview, fast-moving objects, highly fast. They were drawing lines of them, hitting the oceans. And this seemed to be responsible for massive water displacement, tsunamis. I think water came in and all went, I'm just trying to think of the geology now, but it went 60 miles inland right to the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro.
Right.
In
70 miles was actually the figure,
yeah.
But yes.
Yeah, so we're talking massive inland water rushing inland as well. And so they seem to be suggesting a possible meteor shower. And so obviously the first thing I'd think of is, where would the meteors come from? And the main culprit, if you will, that the best theory, most plausible one for me would be some sort of disturbance to the asteroid belt, which exists between Mars and Jupiter, right? Now, just to give viewers out there a bit of a detail about the asteroid belt, I said that the Earth is about 93 million miles from the Sun. That's its mean distance, and it's only a slight elliptical orbit. We call that 1 astronomical unit. Mars is the next planet out, and it's about 1.5 astronomical units. And then after that, Jupiter. And Jupiter is 5.2. So between Mars, 1.5, and Jupiter, 5.2, we've got this massive debris field, and it's very widely scattered. It begins at about 2.2 AU to about 4.75. And the material in there, it ranges from, I think the largest sized object is actually called a dwarf planet, which is like a very spherical body. It's called Ceres. That's Ceres. And its diameter is about 600 miles, I believe, something like that. Just to compare that to our moon is 2,160 miles in diameter. So Ceres is about 600 miles. And Ceres alone makes up 1/3 of all of the mass of the asteroid belt. There's about 26 other fragments that are all about 100 miles or so in diameter, or just slightly above it or so. And then you go right down to smaller ranges, right down to dust. And it's stretched between this band, right? It's just very widely dispersed. And in fact, the material of the asteroid belt is only about 4% of the mass of our moon, right? So it's very widely dispersed. So if we're going to have a meteor shower hit us, right, I'd be thinking we need some object to come along in a highly eccentric orbit from outside, because it will have to be penetrating deep into the solar system, and it could draw some of that matter with it, right? And this is why, one of the reasons why in that model I gave you, Kerry, I show it again, a highly inclined orbit. For me, that's necessary for stability in order to have a stable interaction with our solar system. It can't be on the same plane as the other bodies. It would have to go under and then cut through, probably halfway or so between another two bodies, right? So that there's not much of a meeting or a gravitational influence of great magnitude. It would cut through the general plane of the solar system, say once, and then fly over the top and go out. And I chose a model, the one I sent you, about 12,000 years, purely because there's some evidence of a possible meteor shower 12,000 years ago. So it made me think maybe an object on a 12,000 year orbital period. But they're very comparable. Whenever you talk about or try to model an object, say, with an innermost approach to the solar system of somewhere around the Earth and Venus, around about that distance, and then you start to say it is several thousand miles in its orbital period, although the ellipses may well be very much different to one another, for most of them, round about that range, the time taken for the object, right, to actually, if you were to say it's incoming and it's at the distance of Pluto at 40 astronomical units out, right, the time taken to get from there to the inner solar system, roughly, say Pluto to halfway between halfway between the Earth and Venus, right, as modelled, it takes about something like 18 years, 18, 19 years. So first of all, if anybody says to you that there's an object out there, we still think it's about Pluto's distance to us and it's incoming, on any plausible orbit we might model, it's about nearly 20 years away, right? It takes about 7 years or so in that model I've given you to get, I think, from Pluto to Neptune. But to get from Neptune then to Jupiter, around about that distance, takes about another 10 years or so, 12 years. But Jupiter then is the first gas giant in our solar system of the range. So you're still talking about a body which is going to spend, out of that like 18 years or so, nearly all 18 years is going to be literally between the gas giants, between, say, Pluto, well, to Jupiter, obviously Neptune's.
Okay, well, let me stop you there, because I did find the model and I have been able to play it for people here, and I'll play it again while you talk about this. But my question is, because you're talking the way you're talking, you're not. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. You can't be talking about this sort of what I would call. You call it an inclined orbit, but I would call it maybe sort of slightly perpendicular or angular, whatever you want to call, to the plane of the solar system, right? So in essence, what you're talking about, it would cut through. In other words, all the rest of the time that it had been spent coming. First of all, I was told that, at least in one case, that the object that John Moore and Mike Harris had been talking about, and Mike Harris's source had been saying that it had, I don't know how it did this, but it slingshotted around a planet. Now, I know that maybe you could talk about the possibility of even doing that, and I don't know if there's even any, without it being guided to do that, I don't even know if it's a possibility, but
yeah.
But do you want me to play this and then you continue to describe what you think is going on here?
Well, yeah, that model there is for, I'll just at least briefly say, it's for, I constructed an orbit in the Starry Night celestial program for an object which has got a mean distance from the Sun of about 524 astronomical units, which is the distance you get if you use an orbital period of 12,000 years, which is what I used. And I set it to have a closest approach to the Sun of halfway between Venus and the Earth. And I use this as a kind of a test model, and I inclined it so that most of the other planets you'll see in the model are roughly on the same plane. But in order to have, for me, stability, if you've got an object which is coming into our solar system many, many times over millions of years, and our solar system is pretty stable over that. If you have a cometary type object, a highly eccentric one, which takes an object from outside the solar system deep inwards, if that's on the same plane, if a highly eccentric orbit, roughly on the same plane as the other planets, over periods of time, it would have to cross through them all on one incoming pass, then go crossing through them all again on an outgoing pass, right? And then not be perturbed or thrown off into a wild orbit or scattered or anything like that. Do you see what I'm saying? For me, there's no real stability in that. This is why, and this is what Harrington himself, Robert Harrington from the US Naval Observatory, is looking at. He came up with models similar to mine in the sense that he was saying the object would have an inclined orbit. In other words, it'll be about 32, in his example, it was 32.5 degrees, I believe, towards the other objects. Now, if the object were to come into the solar system, and in Harrington's model he did not model it that way, but in mine I do, and if it did come into the solar system, then the object would be travelling underneath the other planets, just quite a way underneath them, and it would have to then, when it gets close to the sun, it would cut through a point of the plane of the other planets, roughly halfway between them, I would imagine, for stability again, and then go up and over. Now, you mentioned about the slingshot thing, and I've read some of the things that the sources seem to say to Mike. I think it's Mike Harris's source, and he mentioned something about this object. On the one hand, he said that it was going to come between 5 and 10 Earth diameters from the Earth. I believe this was on the 17th of August, so one day from now, right? So
yeah.
Man,
well, actually, I mean, I think it's what I understood was between the 17th of August and 26th of September, like there was a period of time. But yeah.
But again, he said planet-sized, and again, I think the object in question, I would class it as planet-sized, but just to be clear, Mars is a planet, but Mars is 1/10 the mass of the Earth. So you could still be dealing with a significant object, but they're saying it makes that kind of close approach, and you can only imagine. It reminds me of that Humphrey Bogart line from Casablanca, you know, of all the gin joints in all the world, why do you have to come into mine? Well, of all the orbits in all the solar system, how can you get an object come by chance, seemingly, in that kind of orbit, so close to the Earth? For me, there's only one possible explanation. If such an object's orbit were to exist, it would have to have been artificially altered to get it to have that trajectory to this close to the Earth. Now, this is where the slingshot thing comes in. Now, he said, right, that he couldn't talk about how it was slingshot, and I think slingshot's his word in an odd sort of way. When I read one of the interviews he did with John Moore, he said, like a slingshot. I don't think that was a term that was given to him by his source, personally. Just not the way I read it. But he says it was a slingshot. Now, straight away, you're thinking about what we do with our probes. Get them to fly close to a planet and slingshot around and pick up speed. And this is one of the other things he said. He said, this object is travelling at a great speed, and I can't tell you how it got there. Well, the only thing that makes sense to me, and there's something that James McCanny said, and also about Hale-Bopp. Do you remember Hale-Bopp? The comet, which there was some reported images of it having a companion. Do you remember that? Yeah. And this was about mid-90s. And there was that Heaven's Gate cult, I think, that committed suicide. And there were some images that were taken of Hale, and it had like a companion flying alongside it. Now, recently, James McCanny was talking about another comet called Mach-Holtz P96. And they were talking about it, and it seemed to have a companion, and also it was discharging, like electrical discharges between them, if you will. And one of the things that struck me about some of the comets out there, maybe, if this is a real story, and I'm in two minds. I tend to think the timeline's too soon. I'm doubtful of these dates, personally, and I'm doubtful that an object is going to come this close to the sun. I think there's elements mixed in that may be in error, but if we are talking about an object which is travelling at what he calls an excessive speed, now in astronomy, because of orbital dynamics, it it doesn't necessarily mean anything spectacular to just say an object's travelling at great speed. If it was travelling at, as if it was powered by its own means, if you will, in other words, not guided by the gravitational pull of other bodies in a natural elliptical trajectory, but if it looked like it was defying that, going in, say, a straight line, there you go, that would be a good indicator, that, or accelerating in a way which was not conducive to an orbital sweep of equal areas and equal times according to celestial laws, then I would say, well, if he's saying that, maybe you've got a craft flying alongside the object and doing a discharge, manipulating it subtly to alter its trajectory. That was the theory that I thought would explain it better, and I don't know whether this slingshot's the real thing, because like I said, if you talk about slingshot, you immediately think about slingshotting around planets, and I do not think this object would have a plausible orbit that would be anywhere near other planets. I think it's going to have an orbit similar to what I've already modelled. It will come up and under, go under the solar system, cut through it at some safe point, and then come back out of it. I think that that's what we'd really be looking at. So for me, I think what he's been told, wittingly or unwittingly, I somehow don't really trust these dates, and I certainly think that the orbital pattern he says, coming this close, 5 to 10 Earth diameters, for me, that would have to have been an object totally manipulated to get it to that. And I suspect that, obviously, it just seems so plausible to me. But I'm looking at, realistically, this idea of the Courtney Brown's work, an object pulling material from the asteroid belt deeper into the solar system. And this would mean that if the object were drawing it closer inwards, as the object continues to go up and around the sun, the other inner planets, not just the Earth, but say Mars, Venus, Mercury, when they move around the orbit of the sun, their own gravitational strength, if you will take over. And then you could have meteor showers coming upwards for all those planets, striking from the south, say, significant sized objects. And this would cause the tsunamis. I think that is a plausible thing. And what I showed, though, with that model, what I was trying to get across was, it would take an object only about something like a year or so to get from, say, Jupiter at 5 AU, or say 5.2 AU, to about the Earth. It takes about a year if it's modelled in accordance with the kind of model that you're showing on screen as a plausible one. And even if you were to have a Sitchin's 3,600-year orbit, you'd roughly get the same kind of value if you're talking about a closest approach somewhere between Mars and Earth. It takes about a year, but at the present moment, this object then, if it is there and is the possible cause of a meteor shower from the south, say, right, it would have to be somewhere in the asteroid belt. And I'd say look out for stories, possibly, Kerry, for any disturbances. If any astronomers out there start to say, hey, there's some jostling going off in the asteroid belt, that we're detecting, that would be, a really...
Well, actually, I think I have heard that there has been some disturbances in the asteroid belt. I have heard that recently. Well, and thank you for all of that. That's great. And I have this model on the screen. I can't get it to play that often, but I think people can certainly... It helps to visualize what you're talking about, I think, for people. What I have a couple questions, and I know there are questions starting to crop up in the chat, and people are getting anxious to ask you these questions. So I'm going to try to get to that place as well. But at the moment, I'm looking to see whether or not this is a helical. Have you heard that idea of a helical sort of model of the solar system, and how do you feel about that?
Oh, well, Helios, you mean the sun, sun-centered?
Well, no, helical. I don't even quite understand it completely. But what I do know that is that instead of the orbits being around the sun the way we commonly think of it, instead it's almost like our whole solar system is being dragged behind the sun, and that we are moving behind the sun like almost like an asteroid belt or whatever.
I've I think I've vaguely heard the term. As far as there were some brilliant experiments done by Dayton Miller in the 50s that actually pinpointed the direction of our solar system moving through space. And he actually found that we were traveling southwards and almost at 90 degrees to the plane of, say, the planets. So you got the sun, the planets, and we're going southwards. I believe it's 208 kilometers per second in that direction towards the constellation. I think it's Dorado, or it means swordfish, if I've got the reference right. He seems to say that the solar system is traveling in that direction. I don't know how it bears on with that model that you're suggesting, though. I've only vaguely, I think, heard the term.
Okay, well, I have heard that, and there's evidence on the web about this. There's a sort of an elderly scientist who actually has posted on the web that if you're interested in learning more about that model, you should contact him, and I can try to find that information for you. But I was also told by someone else that indeed that is accurate and that we are misled about our solar system. I know that we're supposed to be also merging with, I believe, Sagittarius eventually, and that's part of the trajectory of our system. And also joining Andromeda. I'm sorry, I'm not, an astronomer at all, and so I don't know exactly what all of that means, and I don't know how that bears on what we're talking about. But I was just curious whether or not this sort of model would interfere with sort of the idea of whether an incoming body would disturb certain planets or not others, and whether every time it came through, regardless of its orbit, even if their orbit was inclined the way you talk about it, if it was a helical system the way it was described to me, and you can look it up on the net, that changes the positions of the planets, in every 26,000 years. They're not quite the way we think of them, and it may not be quite as threatening to, in other words, throwing off the orbits by size and so on. So I don't know, I'm just throwing this out. So if you don't know anything about that model, though, it won't really help. I do believe that there's lots of evidence, and I think that Harrington was killed because of what he knew. I really do believe that. We have evidence from Luca Scantamburlo when we went to Italy to talk to Cristoforo Barbato, who had been approached by a Jesuit who was part of SIEV, the secret intelligence service of the Vatican, who apparently leaked this information about a planet, an incoming body. Now, Luca had followed that trail. Cristoforo Barbato was a journalist at the time. This made major news. But what happened to Cristoforo was he actually, the Vatican interfered with his life to such a degree at that point that he lost his job and was unable to continue, and was unable to get a job anywhere, and was becoming destitute when we made our trip to Italy. And at that time was so depressed that we were not able to actually interview him in person. Instead, we interviewed Luca Scantamburlo, who had been in correspondence with Barbato about the Jesuit testimony. Our car was broken into at the Milan airport during this time, and nothing was taken, but it was clear they thought we had been given a tape of some kind. In other words, there were a lot of sort of a collision of things going on that seemed to point to the fact that there was something very important and very secret about this testimony that Barbato had received, and that this Jesuit priest coming from SIEV actually did know about an incoming body. Now that was several years ago. Since then, of course, now the more recent thing is that we've got these people talking about incoming bodies. There's been lots of sort of people seeing sightings even in the skies. I get photographs sent to me constantly where people think they're showing some kind of planet, some kind of object. But besides that, I also have this testimony from the source that apparently was a source for Bill Deagle, Dr. Bill Deagle, John Moore, and Mike Harris, all of whom have a science background, by the way. And this evidence came from a foreign intelligence source who himself has a science background, who I was able to speak with briefly or for a little while and have lost contact with because he found himself to be inundated by tracking when he got in touch with me.
Did they give you any details on the object of other than just confirming that it exists and it's incoming? Did they talk about orbits?
The trouble is and this is where it gets very convoluted and where I'm trying to make sense of all of the information, and one of the reasons I'm having you on today is, on the one hand, there can be a psyop, so they could very well be an object. It may not be coming on these dates, but they're doing a sort of a Tavistock kind of test of people and how the information travels once it's put out there in a certain way. Even intelligence agents can be used and information can be planted on them to then distribute, and they think they've got legitimate information. Now, this particular scientist, who is also an intelligence agent, seems to have a very strong responsibility towards humanity, and he seems very, very serious. So he himself feels that he overlooked some data that sort of substantiated this information. And there was sort of no mistaking his feeling that he was conveying, at least to me, in terms of his voice, that this information was correct and real for him. Now, he could still be mistaken, and the date, he could be correct about the object or even its trajectory, but he could be wrong about the dates, as anything could, again, if this is a psyop. Now, I recently had another conversation with an intelligence agent who is involved here in the United States, and he actually substantiated that there is an object incoming. I have this NSA whistleblower. I mean, I have a huge, it's almost like a laundry list of evidence and people who have been talking about this to me or to Camelot for quite some time, years in fact. But more recently, I have this NSA whistleblower who came through another source, completely unrelated to this foreign intelligence agent, who has talked about the fires in Colorado being set on purpose because they are moving very large equipment, some of which is apparently large craft. But some of that equipment is supposed to have something to do with trying to move the Earth off its very slightly off its current orbit and the moon. And it sounds outlandish, sounds unbelievable.
No, I'll tell you exactly what they're thinking, actually. Your own passage with Miriam Delicado said it brilliantly. And when I talk about earthquakes and how they occur with like split-second timing.
Okay.
Well, the Earth orbits the Sun, right, about 18.5 miles a second, right? Now, if you were to just slightly try to alter just slightly these kinds of variables, the positioning of any conjunction patterns, right, which may be very destructive, it could be nullified slightly or reduced. And it's like Miriam Delicado said, she warned some people when she was going from a skiing trip down a mountain, delay things about 60 seconds, and they avoided a pile-up. And it's the same kind of thing here. In terms of, I mean, when we mentioned about the flooding, as per Courtney Brown's work, the meteor shower and it being caused by another object, right, sweeping in some material from the asteroid belt is one thing. But the other thing is the work of Cliff High, which is very much related.
Yes.
And he talks about a global coastal event. And in one of his recent interviews, he talks not about a meteor shower, but he talks about the cracking of the Pacific Plate, right, as an action which seems to be a part of this. Now, what causes the Earth to crack would be an expansion. And again, he mentions this. And he even mentions, he might use different terminology to me, but I think there's many similarities. He mentions that the Earth may receive a measure of matter, right, from, say, the sun or whatever. And this is what I believe earthquakes are all about, transmitting matter, exchanged between the planets, right? And it's the withdrawal of matter from just under one body and its emergence simultaneously, without passing through intervening space, its emergence there over several seconds, and this is what causes or manifests as the earthquake. Matter is exchanged between the planets, and what regulates the flow rate is the music of the spheres, the resonant patterns established by the solar system, the sun, the moon, the planets, all their patterns, right? And so most earthquakes, as I say, of great magnitude, they don't involve conjunctions, right? But if you do get conjunction patterns of extreme power and accuracy, they're going to be radical matter transfers. In my book, Kerry, I reveal certain laws of proportion for the solar system and how things relate. If you subtly alter the elliptical path of, say, the Earth around the Sun, the shape of the orbit slightly, you would alter also the mean distance between the Earth and the Sun. And by consequence, you would alter slightly the orbital period, 365.24218 days or whatever. You'd slightly alter that. And one of the laws in my book, well, there's two combined, tell you that any change to the Earth's tropical year is directly proportional to a change to the physical equator of the Earth. So if the Earth were to get agitated slightly, from resonant agitation, being caught up in a powerful conjunction pattern, it would fluctuate slightly. And if it just moves slightly closer to the Sun and slightly further away, you'd physically get the Earth contracting and expanding. And for me, the disaster scenario that Cliff High talks about is best manifested or caused by conjunction patterns, which is what all the ancients speak of. There's so many mythologies about the destabilization of the Earth and its axis caused by conjunction patterns, and that would tie in to physical disruption of the Earth and its plates. And even in Plato's mythologies, in one of the disaster scenarios involving Phaeton, the cracks form in the Earth and reveal the underworld and Hades, and I think it's called Tartarus or something, and is revealed to the Earth, and water flows into holes and cracks everywhere. And I think that what Cliff High is talking about, his scenario, involves conjunction patterns. So if you can actually modify the Earth's orbit slightly, and I mean just slightly, just make it, move it so that it's just going to not get these optimum conjunction patterns, then maybe the destruction can be reduced significantly. I believe that must be the intention of what they're doing.
Okay, well, that's very good, and thank you for that. That's fascinating. I don't know what people are going to think about that, but it would be very interesting to hear their response here. And I am looking at the chat right now. So just in terms of what we've spoken about so far, do you want to, in other words, is there anything that you want to add to this before I start taking questions?
I'm just trying to think. I think I mentioned everything I wanted to say, but other than just to say that, at least on the point of this orbital body coming in, for me, looking at the plausible models that I have come up with, I would say that if there's an object out there, it has to be somewhere in the asteroid belt, at least. It couldn't be any further out than that. Going by at least the timeline that, if we're looking for this, and again, I'm mainly focusing on Courtney Brown's work, early 2013, if we're looking at something like that, then this object would have to be roughly somewhere midway in the asteroid belt. I don't know, 3 astronomical units out, 4, somewhere around about there, and incoming. And I would say that if we go by the ancient myths, a plasma discharge of this object, if it achieves a certain conjunction pattern, similar to Comet P17 Holmes, that did the same thing, that would be possibly the thing that announces this object to the world, because I don't think the gravitational perturbations are going to be significant enough that the general populace are going to latch onto it. You know what I mean? I think that they could cover this up right until they need to. And I think if it is a body of prophecy or of mythology, and you could say prophecies about what's going to come again, which is already recorded in myth, then I would say that I believe that we're looking at certain plasma effects with our solar system, and I think that, again, and this is what I'm trying to do in my latest video on actually, some of the possible conjunction patterns that tie in to even like the Mayan calendar systems, the Aztec systems, that I think could trigger these earth changes, because I think that the thing that would cause the meteor shower for Courtney Brown's work is not the same thing that would cause a global coastal event as per Cliff High's work. I think both of them are right. I think both of them are. You talk about two different things.
Well, they actually have
the same kind of displaced, many destructive effects, but in a different angle, if you know what I mean.
Okay, well, they both spoke to each other at length, and Cliff High, I don't know if you know this piece of information, but Cliff High actually, after hearing the Courtney Brown live event that I did, he went out and hired his own group of remote viewers and gave them a blind sort of study to do, and which was similar in that direction of 2013, and he got the same information back from them as what Courtney had gotten. So he then got in touch with Courtney, and he was very, I guess, impressed with the whole situation in terms of what he was coming across. So it is very, very interesting. Their information complements each other rather than goes in opposite position. But at this moment, also, I wanted to know if you've heard about the 188-day window for major earthquakes that supposedly has been happening. I know Sean David Morton emphasizes this a lot. I forget where this window came from or who had been noticing it, but supposedly we're coming up on another one of those windows in September sometime, if I remember correctly.
I don't really buy this 188 days, because some of the people that I've seen seem to relate it to the incoming object, and there's no way, if you've got an incoming object and it gets close to the solar system and it's in a highly eccentric orbit, that you could have a stable 188 days. The only way you could have an 188-day cycle is if you had two objects, say the Earth and then another object, and they were both circular orbits, and they were both orbiting round the sun, and one was roughly somewhere near where I think Saturn is. I did a calculation on this because somebody asked me about this very point. You'd have to have another object somewhere roughly about 10 AU out, and it would have to give you this 188 days from that, something like that. And I don't buy it. I think the earthquakes are too complicated, and because they're based upon the positions of the planets, and they're all very novel in achieving new patterns, I do not buy this 188 days as tied into a celestial body, at least. But if there's another cause, I don't know what that could be.
Okay, so you cannot explain, in other words, the 188-day. They're not joking. There is 188 days between some of these events, although at times I've heard that it's actually not quite 188 days. Sometimes it varies by a few days or something. And I don't know what would be the significance of that. I don't know if 188 days, in other words, if it's an Illuminati Haarp-induced earthquake, I don't know why they would choose 188-day windows, for example. I don't know if there's a symbology there.
I'm not really. I must admit, I'm not really certain. The only theories I've heard put forward regarding it are connecting it to the incoming object, and there's no way that you can get conjunction patterns stable every 188 days or fixed. That would be possible if it's a highly eccentric orbit coming in. It would all break down when it gets closer to.
Okay, but what I was thinking was, is there something besides an object, incoming object? In other words, if the 188-day earthquake window similarity thing, if that could be induced by something other than an incoming object?
Well, you'd have to be looking at some sort of celestial pattern related to the Earth in some way. And obviously 188 days, if you multiply that by 2, it's 376, close to one Earth orbit. you'd have to come up with some, and I don't know. I don't believe that there's any patterns in any of the known bodies in the solar system. Maybe you're looking at rotational patterns of the sun, or I have no idea how to derive a 188-day pattern for any celestial phenomenon.
Okay, doesn't that lend itself to saying, though, then that these are the artificially induced earthquakes?
That's possible, but at the same time, I say, why do it?
I don't know. I have no idea. But the only thing is, if you can't find a natural pattern for a 188-day window, and if indeed they are able to observe, I guess they're observing the very largest events as being 188, days between each other. And I'm not actually. I'm sure someone else is following that, but. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out in case there was some correlation that you found. Okay, we've got lots of questions. So at this point, if you wanted to take a short break and, for 5 or 10 minutes, we could come back and ask the questions, or we can just plunge on through. It's up to you.
Yeah, go for it. Keep on going.
Okay, so I'm going to be looking in the chat here, and let me see. I'm going to readjust this window so that I can get this chat room visible on my screen simultaneously while I'm talking to you. And I don't actually know if I've got any help behind the scenes here. Guess I could try to see if I do. That would be really amazing. Hold on one second here. So what I'm doing now is I'm trying to see if either my webmaster or someone else is posting into the chat the questions, and if not, okay, we just have some people trying to help me with other things, but they're not the people that are picking up the questions and posting them in the chat. So let me see. How did I do that? Okay, I've got that. All right, so do you believe Haarp is related to any of the earthquakes?
That's a tricky one. I think Haarp is definitely the known big conspiracy device, and I've actually got his book. It's been a while since I've looked at it now. Nick Begich, Angels Don't Play This Harp. And I know one of the key references he cites, I think it's an Alaskan earthquake, maybe 1964. Disturbances in the ionosphere, seem to correlate to earthquakes. And I think, again, he builds up a case in the book for an over-the-horizon capability involving like light reflectors, and that they could beam the beam from Haarp, the facility on the ground, the antenna array, beam it up as a focus point, bounce it around, and maybe, I think this is what it appears to be suggesting, and then target it on certain places. I mean, the thing about any weapons like that, for me, is you can only stimulate a situation which has already, at least, has the potential to give you an earthquake. And this is what nuclear weapons do. I believe they tap into the same mechanism as is responsible for natural earthquakes to actually engineer a nuclear explosion. And so Haarp as a device would appear to be, if it is capable, and I don't know whether it's really suited for this. I'm not an expert on the real technicalities of Haarp, but I'd imagine that if it depends on how advanced you think the secret world really is, because I would suspect that if they've got what you might call free energy devices, they wouldn't need all the natural reserves. I think is it a natural gas place that feeds Haarp? Would they need that? Why don't they have orbital platforms based upon this technology that they could target direct?
Well, actually, I think they do.
That's what I mean. I think we've gone way beyond Haarp. I think they'll love it that everybody blames Haarp on all these earthquakes. I think they're laughing in the sense in little control booths, these NSA people, everybody's blaming Haarp when they've got all these satellites upstate, It could be like that. I think that when it was conceived originally, there's all these patterns seeming to point towards disruptions of communications, disruptions to the atmosphere as a missile shield to disrupt incoming ICBMs from Russia. all, if it developed into something more, I don't, I don't think that was obviously the intention at the outset, but maybe they've found better ways to engineer earthquakes. I think that devices planted in the ground or orbital arrays doing things is probably going to be far better platforms for doing it than Haarp.
Okay, another person who has no idea that I'm on the air here. Sorry about this. It's awkward. Okay, let's see. Well, I have to say that in terms of Haarp, there is it's. I'm losing my train of thought, but in terms of Haarp, there is evidence that orgone, the use of orgone to create weather, changes. It started out with Wilhelm Reich. I think Tesla also did things along these lines, and then certainly James Trevor Constable was altering and creating rain, et cetera, et cetera. Haarp itself, we have Brooks Agnew, who worked for and did an experiment to create an earthquake. I don't know if you've heard about that experiment, but he worked on Haarp in the early days, from what I understand, and has testified to that effect, that it does have the ability to create earthquakes by bouncing this pulse into the ground. And so on. Now, they may be doing it other ways. I agree with that. I do think that Haarp is involved also in erecting a shield, as you say, but I actually think it's more than a missile shield. I believe that it's a shield to also detect, or sort of a force field against UFOs and sort of invasions from visitors that are not so friendly to Earth. So I believe it may have some positive effects. I know that it disturbs whales and all kinds of sea creatures, and it has also been very detrimental to the planet, and that various countries have established Haarp facilities. In other words, Russia, China, and even some smaller countries. So the indications there are that it must be very good at whatever it does. Otherwise, why would these other countries have followed suit? And I think it is involved in weather wars, etc. But I believe space-based platforms seems like a very logical extension of that. So I'm sure we could go down that road to some degree.
I mean, just on that point, if we've really got these anti-gravity devices, and we've got the technology nailed on that point, and I do believe we could have massive space stations in orbit right now, massive ones. Do you know what I mean? I think the International Space Station thing that we're all aware of is probably a joke compared to what they must have. All that ferrying all little bits and pieces up on the shuttle. If they can just anti-gravity, they could get so much up there. I think there's probably so much stuff out there in orbit that is unacknowledged. I really do.
Right. Okay. Let me look at some of the other questions that are coming along here, and I'm just trying to grab them. Let's see. Okay, I guess people would like you to address the idea of the underground bases, and whether, in other words, on a certain level, you can look at things directly in sort of in astronomy, or you can look at the effects on Earth of the way the powers that be are operating at this time. And a lot of what they're doing is making preparations. There seems to be absolutely it's just unequivocal that they are doing this. And so they are. I've got evidence that they're stocking up on food and weapons, for example, that they've built all these underground bases worldwide, that they have been making preparations, and perhaps even there's this thing called Project Exodus that I just reported on my blog yesterday or the day before. Has to do with taking groups of people, chosen groups of people off planet altogether, possibly terraforming the moons of Jupiter, I was told, and Saturn, as well as one moon of Uranus. And so we've got a sort of pattern of behavior that seems to be indicating something coming along. And there's also the buildup of the military. There seems to be a lot of activity here, at least in the United States, with our military. Now, you could say, well, we're going possibly to war, but some of these preparations seem to involve evacuating the coasts, militaries that are moving a lot of equipment away from the coastal areas. I'm told we have testimonies, again, from witnesses talking also about possibly an event on the East Coast that may be imminent. I've got one person, I forget who it is, I think it is John Moore, who has actually said tomorrow that they
17th.
That they had to...
One of the Mike Harris sources, 17th of August.
Well, yeah, but this seems to be, maybe it's associated, but he's also saying that they had to evacuate the East Coast. In other words, that the East Coast was going to be hit in some major way starting tomorrow with whatever this is. And so that militaries on the East Coast, I've got, people writing to me, just average people who have family members involved in some cases, reporting that those bases have a high degree of activity, etc. So to get back to all of that, how do you, sort of address that trend that we see going on worldwide that indicates there must be something going on, whether it's an incoming body or whether we're moving into a certain area of space that is impacting us, whether Paul LaViollette's theory of the superwave is indeed on its way here and we're being impacted with the early signs of that. What would be your reply to that?
Kerry, I think essentially everything's going on. We often hear about, the very term day of reckoning. Well, we are having a financial day of reckoning globally, and I think we're going to have a geophysical day of reckoning as well in many ways. I mean, you don't necessarily even need to go down the deep esoteric route and talk about pole shifts necessarily. I mean, I think it was a very, I'm just trying to think of the journal or whatever, quite a prestigious journal was talking about Carrington events, and they were saying we could have a 1 in 8 chance of another one occurring in the next 10 years. And if that takes out the power grid, there was one study said worst case scenario, and it was in the United States, within 1 year of that happening, 9 out of every 10 Americans would be dead. The just-in-time system would fail, right? You'd have the complete breakdown, the financial monetary system failing there. All these preparations you're talking about, the guns, and I've been reading some of the stories in particular on how they're putting an extra 750 million rounds of hollow point bullets for the Department of Homeland Security in the US.
Yes.
Yes. They've even got the Fisheries Division and buying them as well, and the Social Security Division. It's crazy, and you get the sense that they're not necessarily maybe going to get all this stuff to try to secure the country, but to defend their own positions, which may well be these deep underground military bases. I feel it's going to be more a case of not controlling us so much on the surface, but keeping us on the surface out of their little hideouts, and I think that the policy, I mean, you'll obviously be familiar with some of the stuff that goes back encounters like with Eisenhower, 1950s, with the UFOs and others. And there just seems to be, like Cliff High was mentioning as well, about studies that have been doing since 60s about humans living underground and how it affects your circadian rhythms and whatever. There's so much information out there to say that preparations have been going on now for the past several decades. And I believe that in some way the entire corruption of the financial system and the corruption of the very direction we've taken has been from the elite screwing everybody to drain as much resources as possible in towards funding all this black budget project work, which is really aimed at saving their own asses and not us, basically.
Yes.
I think that we've really gone down a road as a country, and I think, I think the term is Anglo-Saxon mission, you'll have heard of.
Yes.
And it was one of the sources from the City of London. And they were saying how they were trying to establish martial law, and one of the reasons given was that it would be somehow, in their words, that the best system to have in place to deal with the great geophysical event that they thought was going to happen. And, this, again, it seems to me that the financial day of reckoning may come first, just prior to the geophysical event. But anything odd going off in the celestial realm, like flares or anything like that, could trigger panic as well immediately. And I do think that all these preparations, the underground bases, everything, it is all designed and has been going on now for decades. And it's not, I don't believe it's for the average man in the street, where, it's a big club and we're not in it, that kind of thing. They're not doing this for us as such. They'll only take, if they are going to save people, they'll take useful people like mechanics or whatever, and that kind of thing. Do you remember that film Deep Impact, where there's some kind of lottery and all that? Some kind of noble way of, the comic's going to hit, but we're going to have 800,000 places for the average man in the street, lottery. I don't buy that at all.
Yeah.
There'll be no warning. These are not noble people. They'll keep everybody covered in a blanket of ignorance right until the last moment.
Sure.
They will play it that way. They will deny everything. I mean, sun could go dark in middle of the sky, and they'll say, "It's a long eclipse." They will throw anything at
yes,
you. I just think that they'll secure their positions, and I think that's what this is all about, really.
Okay.
I think realistically, for practical purposes, we are on our own up on top, and I hope that these guys get crushed in their big containers. if they really are as evil as we think, if they really are, there'd be some irony to it. You think,
yes,
if they've screwed us to try to save themselves,
very interesting,
and they got taken out, buried alive, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it.
Okay, let me see if I can find some other questions here, and if at some point we're going to wind this up, but let me see. Let's see. Someone is commenting that sort of along the same lines that NASA has made no announcements other than that one very pronounced announcement, which was to warn their people, their employees, to prepare. And I believe the instructions also involved even John Moore heard a sort of reports a military briefing of families supposedly recently where they were told to bring one suitcase. So in other words, we've got something here going on. I have also, there are anecdotal information that I get sent all the time. For example, carpenters in the north, around Boston area, have been reporting the bankers' houses are emptying, that the people are absolutely disappearing with their families in the dead of night and just completely abandoning their houses. There has been evidence also of scientists who find that their coworker is suddenly gone. All trace of them disappeared. That they're gone from their house. They suddenly they're just simply gone. That report has been going on for a while. The banker thing is only been in the last, let's say, 2 years, I think, to where this kind of preparation, perhaps they've been given their ticket or whatever. So I'm seeing if there's anything else in here that I can ask you about. Well, I'm not seeing anything else. Hold on one second here. I don't know. I guess this is a joke. Do you have your ticket? Obviously you don't, right?
No. I might get a big online order from Asda, though, for a few bottles of Volvic water and a little camping stove. And lots of nails and wood, and I'll just board up my windows and, You're not taking me alive. I live in a town about 250,000 people. It's pretty, Britain, in fact, as a country, very densely populated.
Yes.
It's, there's about 58 million on mainland Britain, something like that. And I think that in terms of our country, it's going to be a very different scenario to the US. And you wonder whether or not, in terms of putting a country on lockdown, I don't think we've got FEMA camps in Britain as such, that kind of thing. I think they'd just section off the country and let everybody be locked down in their own home as a prison cell, if anything like that. Again, I'm thinking of the Carrington thing, I'm thinking of the financial thing, I'm thinking of those kinds of things where they might still have a surface potential. If we're talking about something blitzing the world with, I don't know, like the global coastal event, if we're talking about something devastating large areas of the surface, that will be the point of getting in the deep bunkers. But I think if those events don't quite occur to that level, martial law type scenarios in many countries, from an economic collapse or from some sort of power grid failure, they'll still be on the ground. But our just-in-time system, globalization has destroyed us. We've got practically no stocks to go on, and if the finances were crashed, if the power, something along those lines went, we'd be in real trouble. We would collapse down to local levels, and it's like you said, the whole distribution of even trying to figure out how to survive again. You'd expect people to be fighting over food, forming bands of, tribes and whatever.
Well, yeah, we call it a Mad Max scenario in America.
Definitely, yes.
That's what we're looking at. If that all happens, someone is asking whether or not what you think of the theories of Velikovsky, where the solar system is not stable. And have you ever researched his work?
I've not read any of his books directly. I've obviously heard references to him, and I think one of the things he was talking about, just because I looked at this topic of the birth of Venus, and he thought that Venus as a planetary body was ejected from Jupiter, and that's where the big red spot came from, and that Venus was somehow originally, in a cometary type object, orbit or so forth. I think that's the pattern there. But I think some of the mythological interpretations, then, I'd probably disagree with him on that. But he's right in saying, and I think even Sitchin's right, pointing out that many of these ancient writings, mythological stories about gods and heroes, they are about celestial events, that kind of thing,
Yes.
And I think it's all about how you interpret them. Some people might interpret a clash of two gods to mean two planets physically colliding. That's where Sitchin gets Marduk hitting Tiamat to create the asteroid belt. I don't believe that interpretation is correct for the creation of the asteroid belt. But in other ways, gods clashing, discharging plasma, lightning between themselves as a natural thing could be, part of these wars and etc. I think that there's part of that. But I agree, again, not all mythological stories relate to the celestial events. I think we are talking about flesh and blood beings as well. It's a very subtle thing you've got to differentiate between.
Okay, yes, I agree with that. Okay. Someone had a question here that I guess I'm trying to find it again. It's just very difficult because what happens is when somebody puts something in the chat, it just kind of jumps around. I think you've been asked this before on we've done a couple live streams, you and I, but I'll ask you again because it is to some degree, you kind of already addressed it in a sense, but someone is asking about Andy Lloyd's work and whether or not you're in touch with him.
I'm not in touch with him. We did the Elenin conference last year. Not actively in touch with him at all. He wrote that book Dark Star, and I think he's gone more into, I think, in very great detail in that book, from what I gather, in terms of looking at disruptions to the outer asteroid belt, the Kuiper belt. And that area, I'm not familiar in depth with his work on that. I have to say, though, I'm not really familiar in depth.
Okay. Well, yes, and I actually think it would be fascinating if the two of you would spend some time talking. But um, as people will know that I interviewed him, but I don't think you agree on the brown dwarf, and it would be fascinating to hear, sort of a dialogue go back and forth as to what he might think of your theories. Um,
It's not so much that, as I said, I do believe we've got a binary companion.
yes,
For
I
me,
understand
it's
that.
probably the solution to precession. I don't believe that we've got a brown dwarf coming into our solar system in any deep orbit. I think that is totally implausible.
Okay, yeah, but that's exactly what I'd like you guys to discuss, because I believe that he does believe that, and he kind of gives quite a good case for it in some ways.
To buy his book then.
Okay, let's see. Quantum leaps associated with matter transference between astronomical bodies. So I guess this question is: do you think quantum leaps are associated with matter transference between astronomical bodies? I think your matter transference idea is a fascinating one, and I think it has a lot of validity. But I guess the person wants to know if quantum leaps. It's kind of
maybe that term quantum leap is not the right one, but I look at this, and again it goes back to the work of Bruce Cathy. Our reality is intermittent, like a movie strip. Everything's manifesting in frame rates of snapshots. And for me, time is the rate of existence of an object in terms of these frame rates. And so if you've got, I don't know, an object, you've got a spatial distance there and there. An object could have, I don't know, a billion frame rates gradually between those points if you had like a ball going like that. And it'd look like it was in motion, moving through space, but that's like a simulation, right? It's a snapshot of displacement going all the way. And what I come up with in my own theories and work is simply this: you can radically alter both the rate of existence of an object, right? And again, let's say you have an object like a ball here, and it's pulsating quote like a billion frames a second or something, and you were to radically alter it so the next frame that it occurred from, and we talk about frames, you ask about where is it when it's not manifest. It withdraws into this zero universe, a kind of singularity, and then pops up again. And it's a subtle point to even get involved in, but it goes back to the work of Walter Russell. Matter is motion, as simulated, and everything has got, there's this foundation of stillness, a zero universe based upon, as he puts it, straight line geometry, if you will. And it's a disturbance of that which causes a state of tension, breaks an equilibrium, and it gets matter formed in spiraling motion to create spheres as a simulation, and then it unravels back to this zero universe. And so for me, when you have certain planetary conjunctions or complex patterns that embody musical ratios, if you will, then you get a sort of pairing set up between, say, two bodies, where there's a precise targeted point, say, just underneath the surface of one body, and it pairs up to a targeted point just under the surface of another. And what you have is a portion of matter, literally, which is usually stable and anchored in that location under one body, manifesting away and keeping its position. And it gets radically disturbed. So its next manifestation is in a snapshot straight at underneath the surface of another body, right? And it basically, you've a localized, over, say an earthquake lasts 30 seconds, you've a localized withdrawal of matter from one portion, or just under one planet. A portion of matter withdraw in its manifestation, and it's simultaneously, without moving through the intervening space, forcing its way in to a region already occupied by matter. And this gives you the geophysical disturbance at both ends, which gives you an earthquake at both ends. One's matter forcing its way in, or the other's withdrawing to create weakness. And I believe that the musical patterns, if you will, of the planets as established, they can give you these radical changes, targeted changes to certain places under the Earth, and cause matter to then withdraw into the zero universe, as Walter Russell talks about. and in a kind of an anchored, targeted way, almost through a path of least resistance, they are drawn towards the other planet involved in the musical signature, the harmony, and that's where they force their way out and come in there. And I think that all the planets in their orbits around the sun, the moons and everything, and the sun itself, they're all dynamically, as we speak, exchanging matter between themselves. And most of the patterns are quite unremarkable. And so you've got low-level matter exchanges. It's like a big, massive portion of matter would go from the Earth to other bodies, but the Earth would receive matter. So there's only a subtle change, and it's happening, in a very dynamic pattern.
Well, Sorry, I'm sorry to stop you here, but let me ask you if you're talking about matter or you're talking about energy.
What's the difference?
Well, no, because there is difference, and there are difference in levels. In other words, I guess matter would be the slowest, energy going sort of the slowest. In other words, a rock. It's said. I mean, you can tell me, but rate of vibration. A rock has it's not that a rock is more is. It seems more solid than a human being, for example, but it really has to do with rate of vibration. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think ultimately, I mean, some people, when they throw out the equation E equals mc squared, they talk about a conversion between matter and energy. And the subtle point is this. Matter, obviously, is, for me, you've got a foundation of stillness, of total equilibrium. You could say that that's, quote, no matter, because matter is motion. That's actually what Walter Russell defines matter as, motion. So if you've got stillness, you've got no matter. But if you create a point you take a point within this zero universe as like putting your finger in a fast-moving stream, you create ripples of curvature around it. And in the same way, this is how matter is drawn off and put into existence, and it is wound up in spiraling patterns that simulate snapshots of more intense spiraling patterns. And this forms a kind of a curved geometry to give you tight little balls of matter. Like, this is what Walter Russell talks about. He gives an entire periodic table of elements about how all the elements are formed from these spiraling patterns, hitting an equilibrium point and ultimately manifesting as carbon in the extreme maturity, which is like a perfect sphere. And so I would say that what we call matter is a state of tension, right? Ultimately, it's something that's been brought into being as motion to simulate an idea, a thought form, and it has a certain tension to it. And this is why you can talk about matter unraveling. And this equation of E equals mc squared is tied into that in a way. Matter casts itself off as radioactivity in the dense, the dense elements at the high end of the periodic table. And whereas it disperses around the universe, what Russell's ultimately saying is, it's not so much that things are dispersed, they are literally withdrawing into the zero universe and then re-emerging, withdrawing and re-emerging. And when they are emerging, they are forming. It is literally form from formlessness. And formed objects are material objects that are brought into being to manifest ideas, thought forms, as a state of tension. And then they unravel.
I wanted to go down that road, and I think you're very good at explaining these things very, very on a very detailed level and very methodical, which I appreciate. I don't know if the listeners appreciate it as well, but I assume they do. But I want to say here is that, aren't you really talking about matter in a sense? Well, there's a few aspects of this. One, which is consciousness directing the matter. In other words, it is said that the earthquakes on Earth are caused by shifts in consciousness, and that countries that are going through sort of transitions in consciousness where the people are sort of less aware tend to have more earthquakes, whereas places, and we're not throwing in the Haarp induced ones here, we're talking about natural occurrences. In other words, we create earthquakes, we create weather, and it's consciousness that also can change that, so that if as people's awareness heightens and as they become more conscious, more self-aware, they also become calmer and less I guess in a state of tumult, whether it be mentally or emotionally. That earthquakes, and again, can smooth out, and you can and weather as well can all be affected by consciousness. And again, consciousness can direct energy.
Well, I think this mechanism I speak about with respect to earthquakes is a balancing mechanism. The earthquakes that occur where we get matter transferred hyperspatially from one body to another, it's like a release valve.
Yes.
Right? So the system is trying to keep itself in balance in that way. So it is a release of tension. And now you mentioned about we cause earthquakes. Again, I suppose you could say correlation or cause and effect. If you've got earthquakes occurring in areas where people are moody, is it that the earthquakes make them moody, or their moody makes the earthquake? But I would say that
at some point, though, no. But I mean, really, there is. I mean, you can look at even 9/11 and the studies they did at I don't know, was it Harvard or whatever, and they traced the occurrence was actually traced in people's consciousness before the event happened. That's in part what Cliff High is trying to do to some degree with his webbot. So there's no doubt whatsoever that tracing consciousness can actually help you to trace the manifestation of events.
This is something that Miriam Delicano was talking about, how we can...
yes.
What is it now? We can actually consciously change the orbit of our planet. And, we are tied to our planet. And I'll give you one very interesting example here. The optimum temperature of the human body is 98.56 degrees, right? Well, the Earth tropical year, if you divide that 365.24218 by 360, right, that ratio there, if you take 100 and divide by that ratio, you get 98.56. And it's one of these slight differences that we have. Just like the Earth year has, in real terms, altered from 360 to its present, the optimum human temperature for us living here has changed and dropped. And so we are tied into the very orbit of our planet as an optimum temperature for our personal health is tied in to the orbital period of the planet. So if you change the orbit, you change us. And if we get hotter and hotter, this is obviously a fever. And I think that, there are all these connections. There's so many ways in which you can connect these things. So many ways.
Right. Well, I also want to say that there's sort of changing dimensions. There's an aspect, I mean, you haven't talked about this, but when this Walter Russell talks about going into this, I don't know what he calls 0 point or place or whatever, I see it actually more in moving maybe possibly into another dimension.
I think that the way he describes it in his book, his book's called Atomic Suicide, the way he describes it is like the ultimate frame of stillness. But when he's talking about different realms, I think that you do have vibrational realms within certain ranges. And then you have these, if you will, singularity or cut-off points when you breach the threshold and enter into a totally new realm. And I think, again, this is what I think Courtney Brown was talking about as well in terms of some of the Earth changes and so forth. I think that the patterns established by planets, they can engage in very exotic things, entire systems. Our entire planet's environment could be energetically transformed, in my opinion, if the right celestial pattern is achieved in our solar system, and likewise with other bodies. And it can significantly bloat up planets, possibly cause them to explode if they're bloated up too much, or achieve new energetic levels of stability, which offer new forms of life, totally different forms of life, to manifest in this new environment. And I think it's one of the things you mentioned on your blog as well about going off-world. You said that some source had told you that humans can't live off-world unless we simulate this Schumann resonance, unless we try to simulate energetically our environment on these bodies. And I think this is, again, it goes to these underground studies about people living underground and whether or not, and even in space as well, I believe I think there was another thing I read about, I don't know whether I've got this right, it was to do with women in space, and they couldn't bear children. It was screwing them up being in space long term. So we're really tied to our planet, if the planet goes, so do we, basically.
Absolutely. Very interesting. Okay. At least in terms of our physical bodies, I would say. All right. So somebody is asking whether you're doing your own preparation. I think you kind of answered that, but do you want to elaborate at all?
Not really. In a way, obviously, I don't want to tell you I've got all good stuff in my house here. I don't want everybody to read. On a serious note, I'd have to say I do not have the will to go to, it's a certain mentality. Would I leave home, pack in a job, buy a farmhouse, get all barbed wire and minefield set up around it, and 20 years worth of freeze-dried food.
Yeah, I hear you.
Buy a load of guns and ammo from the underworld criminals, and just get signs up, you can't take me alive. I just, I'm not doing anything like that at all. I think I'm pretty much just going on with my life as normal, and I think ultimately, everybody's going to die, and I know it says it's a simple point, but it's what you're comfortable with doing when you're alive, and how you interact with people up until that point. And I think there's no desire on my part to engage in those kind of preparations, because I've not been brought up with that mentality, and in a densely populated country like Britain, and I'd have to think about, literally, if I was serious about some of these scenarios, like a meteor shower, I'd have to move to a different country if I were even attempting to be serious about it. And I'm just not inclined to do that, really.
Okay.
In a way, I'd be thinking I might mentally be getting all screwed up if I did. I'd think, I'd be cracking or something. That sort of way.
All right.
Some people would actually see it as a challenge, as an adventure. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
And I'd say I do not believe that everybody out there who's doing these things and maybe buying all the stuff and getting all guns and ammo, especially in America, I think people out there seeing this as, if you're doing it for like the best reasons, and you almost see it as a new way of life, something exciting, and that's brilliant. If you're doing it because you're really afraid, I'd say that's bad.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's the right mentality in terms of doing this, and I'm doing what I'm comfortable with, just getting on with my life, dare I say. And I'm not making any intense preparations at all, to do this. I think maybe the economic chaos might hit first, or you'll have to get to know your neighbours when it hits the fan. You know what I mean?
I was in Paris, and it's fascinating. The French government is actually doing these get to know your neighbor days. I don't know what they couch it as, but it was happening when I was visiting Paris last, and it's quite fascinating because in a major city, this has become quite a phenomena in Paris, where the people are doing this on a regular basis. I don't know if it's every month or how often it is, but it's become sort of a social, get-together kind of thing. At the same time, there is a method behind the madness. I mean, this is kind of like the sort of what they call the velvet glove type of ruling over people. Like in America, they don't tell you to do anything. They just kind of like say, they build their camps and try to scare you to death. But in Europe, they encourage you to kind of get to know your neighbor, but they don't tell you why you're doing it. It's just interesting, kind of psychology as to how they sort of deal with this kind of stuff. We do have a couple other questions, and then I think we do need to sort of wrap this up because we've been going for a very long time. The photon belt has been outside our solar system for a long time. Couldn't this be a major reboot for the entire Milky Way galaxy? The eclipse in 2012 could intercept important energetic lines. That's what someone's writing.
I don't know about the photon belt. This is a theory. Well, it's a term I've heard. I'm not really sure much about that. But as far as if you're talking about the 2012, I don't think that this galactic pattern is of any significance energetically, and I don't think the Mayan calendar's tied into that. The long count. I think the Mayan long count is all about conjunction patterns, and that's actually. My latest video discusses that very point about, the backton cycles of 144,000 days and 7,200 days. I show how they can be used to accurately track in particular Earth-Jupiter conjunctions. And so I'm more along the lines of the ancients, for me, are very clear about when they talk about conjunction patterns being associated with the end of age events. And I don't think that they involve necessarily the galactic center, which the galaxy, the band and everything, when you look at it, it's a real disorganized mix. You don't get the precision in modeling that you do when you're looking at the planets, and I don't see anything from the galactic center energetically being of significance. I think if there is a photon, but if we're moving through a different region of space, that's a different matter entirely. I'm not familiar with that theory too much, though.
Okay. Well, and I think the same person is going on to say, and I think that, at least I would also like to ask that in terms of, do you know who Patrick Gerald is?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't particularly agree with him, but I did interview him, and it is on Camelot. The thing is that he actually did a post. There was a post on George Urban Survival or Urban something. Anyway, his website where he lists, Patrick Gerald had sent him an email and listed all the various sort of lineups of the planets for the next few days. It actually started, I think, August 12th, and it went to August 24th. And he was saying which planets were lining up how. And I just wondered whether you kind of already answered this, but I'd like you to address it from this point of view, that with those lineups, do you think that there's anything major going on that could affect Earth changes, for example?
And, I've been looking at the solar system quite a bit, and I've just got my Starry Night program up even now, and in terms of I have looked at these very patterns to try to figure out whether or not there is anything possible in terms of alignment. And there are a few interesting ones, but nothing that jumps out at me, if you know what I mean. I've got the thing going up right now. Let's see now. We're in August the 17th. Jupiter and Ceres nearly. That's going up about 20th or 30th of August. We did have a conjunction of the Sun, Mercury, and Venus. That one 11th of August, roughly about there. It's again.
Yeah, I actually have this on my website on one of my blog posts. I posted the information for people, but I guess the question is not whether they're happening, which I think is commonly known and understood for those that study the astrology, but whether or not you think, as Patrick Gerald seems to think, that it indicates that we're going to have a major Earth change event because of the lineups.
Well, if I might, Kerry, the chat box at the bottom of the screen there, I've just posted an image. I might have sent you this one before. Patrick Gerald talks about and I don't know whether you could put that image so your viewers could see it as well.
All right, let me see if I can.
Image. If you click on that.
Okay.
Do you see the image?
I'm actually seeing if I can get whatever it is you're sending me. See, you're saying you're sending me an image.
The URL in the chat box.
You've got it. Okay. Yeah,
It's in Sky.
All right, let me see if I can get it. Okay, yes.
You click on that, and
right.
You'll see the pattern established, yeah? I might have said that before. Because Patrick Gerald talks about, in particular, the great day of disaster being right on the solstice point. And I don't know whether could you actually put that so your viewers could see that image?
Yeah, I am doing that right now.
Because it's a split screen thing. And on the one side, on the left-hand side, it says August the 28th, 1859. And that right there is the pattern, right? And that day is the very day when his name was Carrington. He observed sudden, intense flare-ups on the surface of the sun, right there. And I've done a very detailed analysis of that pattern. This is going to be my latest YouTube video evaluating it. And then we had a series of conjunctions which seemed to play out between two alignment patterns, and they occurred over a period of about 3 to 4 days. And what happened on the September the 1st of 1859 is this coronal mass ejection, the Carrington effect, and it hit us 17 or 18 hours later and caused massive geomagnetic storms on the Earth. And the telegraphs were the height of technology communication-wise at that time, and it fried them, right? And it caused the aurora borealis to go right down to the lower latitudes. And it struck me, looking at the Mayan calendar and looking at the build-up to it, we've got a pattern which begins on December the 18th of 2012, right? And you again have the planets are in a very similar type of pattern. And the conjunctions involved in the 2012 alignment as play out literally over the next 3 days following December the 18th. They culminate in a Venus transit, right, between Saturn and Venus. In other words, if you're centered at the center of Saturn looking at the sun, the disk of Venus goes over like a little black dot over the disk of the sun. So you've got these transit level events. In fact, right there on the 18th of December, 9.36, this is 2.6 days prior to the beginning of the final day, and 2.6 days is a correction measure known to the Mayans and the Aztecs. They even employed it in their 52-year cycle. And right at this moment here, you'd see Venus and Mercury. That there, literally at this moment, is a transit of Mercury. If you were positioned at the center of Venus looking at the sun, you've got Mercury as a little black dot on the surface of the sun, right at that pattern. And so you have a series of accurate conjunctions that play out over the next 3 days, which just are so uncanny in the familiarity to the pattern of the 1859 event. This is why I'm wondering whether or not this particular pattern, as does seem to coincide with the Mayan calendar, could be of the same sort of energetic significance. For me, if we're going to see a great Earth change, a great pattern, a CME, we're going to have some conjunction patterns associated with it. They'll manifest as the event occurs and even trigger it. So, I mean, is it online, Kerry? Is it? Have you
Oh
seen?
yes, absolutely. People are looking at it as you're speaking, and it's very graphic and very clear, fascinating. And I'm very glad that you sort of went to this area. I have to ask you though, because there was a Venus transit when I went to Mount Shasta in June, I guess it was, and I don't know what the configuration was at that event, or whether there was any similarity to what we're seeing in front of us here, either in 1859 or in December 18th. But I thought there was some relationship.
There was. I think that was June the 6th, that Venus transit.
Yes. Yes.
And then there was 8 years previous to that. I don't think that pattern there did not, as I said, cause any massive changes. I think that it didn't have all these other bodies involved, though. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
The patterns of the heavens are very novel in a way. And even though I look at these two patterns here, they're not exactly identical. For all we know, nothing could happen on December the 1st or in the 3 days upwards. But the synchronicity here that we've got the completion of the cycle, the Mayan calendar, and their calendar systems are tied into world ages and the destructive events that go with them. For me, that's a given. The mythologies as decoded tell me that that's solid. So interesting patterns which do seem to tie into their calendar. They're very intriguing. They pique my interest. As I say, though, I don't want to tell anybody we are definitely doomed because of this pattern. It's very
Well, I
speculative.
hope not. Well, I mean, it is interesting. Look at the angle, though, is more severe. I wonder if there's any significance to that.
Well, possibly, but if you look at the angle, it's almost 120 degrees, like almost fits, into thirds. There's 360 degrees in a circle, and in the 2012 one, it's almost 120. So it's hard to say. you could. There's. I don't know whether that plays too much of a part, but really, it's primarily on the fact that the conjunction patterns are very accurate, with of a transit level for several of them in 2012, and not only that, we've got the Earth at the solstice point, and this is again is a seasonal marker in mythology associated with, say, Berossus. From Babylon, 4th century BC, he spoke about great destruction via fire and water at these seasonal markers, these solstice points and equinox points. So in mythology and even in some of the works, again, it is ultimately very speculative, but so very intriguing. And when you combine it with all these preparations, it makes me wonder whether or not the powers that be do have certain dates of concern in their calendar. This might be one of them, coinciding with the, the Mayan calendar.
Great, but my question was actually if right now those conjunctions that I mentioned that Patrick Gerald is talking about, in other words, you're talking about a December 18th sort of date they might have in their calendar, and I'm wondering, is it possible they do have this span of days here through from, let's say, the 17th through the 24th on their calendars or not?
Well, anything's possible. The complexities of earthquakes are difficult, and this is why, within this range of dates you say, it could be that there is a very powerful configuration that does give us a high magnitude earthquake. And as you know, Kerry, it's all about where the earthquake is. If it was near to a real populated area or to some financial centre of great significance or something like that, it could be a game changer. Do you know what I mean? It all depends. I don't necessarily see anything particular in the conjunction patterns in the next month or so. I have looked at them. I'd have to look at them again just to, but I have looked at them over the next month or so. There's nothing that leaps out at me, at least not like the one I've just presented there.
Okay, but, no, and I really appreciate that, and I'm sure that the people listening do. Your explanation is fascinating. All right, well, at this point, I think that we should basically kind of call it a day, so to speak, for this event. And I want to thank you so much, Keith. You've done a wonderful job, and I think it's been fascinating listening to you describe your answers to the many questions that I've been asking and that people have asked, as well as to describe your own work and your perceptions of what is going on. At this time, I guess, why don't you give your URL and the name of your book again and that sort of thing. And if you do have something coming out soon, I know you make your own videos, and sometimes we're able to put them up on my YouTube channel on Camelot as well. So so people can be on the lookout for that, because I know that anyone listening would probably be very interested in hearing anything that you're starting to publish.
Well, I'll do my URL. I'll have to set all this up.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can get you on the screen, full screen. I have been trying to. Hold on one second here. I'm going to try to do this logistically without. It's there's kind of hard to do all those. Get these things when I'm taking questions. On the one hand, I'm using Skype in more than one way, so that's why we have this sort of issue going on. Okay.
The website is actually called ancientworldmysteries.com, and it's dashes between words. And as I said, there's lots of good essays on there, which put some of the basic theories I've got. Most of them are in my book, which is what I'm holding right now. Is it coming on screen?
Yes.
Yeah. I say the book, as I say, the book is called The Lost Age of High Knowledge, and you can actually get more details about the topic areas, and they're covered on the website listing there, ancientworldmysteries.com. And the book is this book here, basically. And okay. It's all about ancient measurement systems and how they tie into secret technology, if you will, even looking at the modern age. Firstly, because areas like measurement and secret geometry, they seem all very abstract, if you will. And what I was looking for was kind of a proof of principle to demonstrate that units of measure we use feet, inches, and these numeric progressions. You can tie them in to real events. You can demonstrate how they are the correct units to map the planets in terms of arc lengths over the surface of the Earth that demonstrate how earthquakes are triggered, and also the placement of highly top secret facilities. And that it's the rediscovery of this ancient knowledge which seems to have gone on, and it's the transformation of the solar system as well as what the book also looks at, and some of the mythologies regarding these great changes. So that's the main area in my website. So there's lots of essays that deal with that. And you can access my YouTube channel through that, which is called Light Descent, and it's all one word. And my latest video on there is about the long count Mayan calendar. The next one I'm trying to produce right now is a very detailed evaluation of that pattern that I showed you on the screen there. And just because this Starry Night program allows you to accurately look at how accurate these conjunctions are, so you can see I'm not essentially making it up, but it's a lot more complex than that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Keith. It's been great, like I said, to have you on here, and we thank you, and I'm sure that the listeners thank you very much. I would like to say that I don't know. Do you take donations at your website?
You know, I do have a PayPal thing, but I've not actually got a donation button. I'll have to get one set up.
Okay, well, if you do, then I think I know that you live very simply, and I think that it would be great if people were able to donate to you to keep you sort of going on your work. And I appreciate if people would donate to Camelot. This was a free event, but we do need to pay for our living expenses, and also to pay for people that are supporting Camelot at this time whenever possible. And that includes Tommy, my webmaster, and I want to thank him for being behind the scenes today in helping to keep all of this going. So thank you again, and let's be in touch, and maybe at some point we can get you and Andy Lloyd together in the near future and get you to talk about all of this.
Who knows? But thanks for having me, Kerry. It's been good.
Okay, great. All right, you take care. All right, bye-bye.
Lately, in particular, about Iran being invaded by Israel and the US together. And it has definitely come across my mind that earthquakes as a weapon may well be used as part of that. And I don't know whether you've heard this particular story, Kerry. It's one that I've not been able to really find much sources on, except maybe one or two. But when Libya was last year, when they were actually really overthrowing the country, there was a reported cover-up of an 8.4 magnitude earthquake, and that occurred, according to this particular source here, it was on the 19th of May 2011, and it was near the coast, and again 8.4. There's a few sources put that out. I'm still in two minds as to whether the sources are legitimate in this sense, but they give lots of data readouts for the subtle, the whole thing, if you will. So it looks like maybe somebody captured a screenshot from a database before it was taken down, but it wouldn't strike me that earthquakes would be used as weapons. I mean, the power of them is phenomenal. It is absolutely devastating. And Iran itself, I'd have to check the records, but I believe they've had earthquakes going back a few decades now, where there were tens of thousands of people killed all in one go with an earthquake near Tehran, that kind of region. So, I even looked at the possibility actually of the Straits of Hormuz and closing them with nuclear weapons. And I did an evaluation of the latitude point, just the pure latitude of where the Straits of Hormuz was. I'd have to redo the calculations, but it seemed favourable and in line with various other latitudes and measures associated with nuclear weapons tests that we know about. So I think that it'd be very interesting to see. But in a way, when we look at that event, these are like just strange last-minute throws of the dice, because I think what we're really looking at, Kerry, are these great earth changes, and it's the the end of age. There we say that. And I mean,
well, before we go down that road, and I appreciate the reference because I know that it's beginning to look sort of like that at the moment, although I'm not completely convinced that that's the case. It is certainly the end of something, and I guess you could call it the end of an age, but it's certainly not the end of this world as we know it completely. It doesn't seem. I think to some degree there's a lot more kind of panic over what we see than there is sort of maybe adding two and two together to see what's going on. So that if you've got a government that's creating, for example, earthquakes in places, taking advantage of what you are talking about, which is how would you term it? I mean, are you sort of referencing the combination of ley lines and hyperdimensional physics, or you know what I'm saying? What?
Yeah. I think I see what you're saying. I know that some theorists, and especially when you talk about ley lines, they are looking at the like a fixed grid upon the Earth, and you'll have heard of the platonic solids,
Right?
You know, the various geometrical shapes, and there are some grid patterns like David Hatcher Childress. He wrote a book, you know, and the anti-gravity in the world grid, and he looked at various models that certain scientists seem to have found, and what I tend to find myself. I have not found any geophysical.
Hi everyone, this is Carrie Cassidy, and we are about to start. I'm sorry for the delay. It's always a problem starting with the logistics and getting the video to work simultaneously with everything else. So if you just bear with me, we'll get this going. I appreciate your patience. So hold on one moment. Wild and crazy. So how you doing, Keith? We are live right now, just so you know.
All right.
And I'm actually in the process of getting this thing to work, but I don't know. It's acting kind of weird. All right.
I can only see you on audio. I don't know.
I know.
Just got an image of you.
It's just, well, I don't know how to make this work, so I'm just not even going to try at this moment. I don't know what to do. It's always like that. It just does this weird thing. Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot. We're here with Keith Hunter, and we're going to be talking about earth changes, Haarp, and consciousness. And Keith is the author of The Lost Age of High Knowledge. How about that? I remembered the title of your book. And showing it on the screen. Okay, that's great. And we do have a chat room along with this this presentation so that you can ask your questions. Just all I ask is if you would put them in caps, please. And so at this moment, Keith, first of all, how are you doing?
Not too bad. Not too bad.
Okay, well, you guys made it. You made it through the Olympics, huh?
Yes. No false flag operation.
There you go. Yeah.
And we won lots of golds. I don't think anybody's been done for drugs on our team either, so can't go wrong, really.
Okay, a little patriotism, I guess. Anyway, so at the moment, you know, we've got a lot going on, and I'm going to try to pull up the seismic indicators so that people can also see what's going on with the earthquakes this morning. I know that we had a super large one. You probably know, I don't know how to pronounce the area of the sea, but it's something like Onhotska or something. Sea near, it's actually in between Russia and Japan, but closer to Japan and the Kamchatka region, where there are sort of a set of volcanoes, I think at least three. And so somebody just put this link into the chat. I don't know if it's going to work that way, but
I've seen the one, the 7.7. Is that what you're referring to?
yeah,
That was
but
2 days ago.
right, that's correct. But at this moment, what you have to do is you actually have to add 1 point, because they downgraded the entire whatever you call that USGS, the magnitudes. I've gotten this from several sources who seem to know exactly what they're talking about. So so if you look at that, you can actually see that it is an 8-pointer.
When you say the downgrading, you're not talking about the difference between the Richter scale and the moment magnetic scale. You're literally saying that they are fudging the results and literally
Yes.
recording them up as one.
Yeah, that is exactly what I'm saying.
Right. No.
Okay. Actually, I don't know why I'm not getting the seismic IRS EDU. Is that what it is? Shoot.
I've got the Australian database open and also USGS. Well, got the USGS open for another reason, but that's where I'm getting it from.
Okay.
They actually cite the USGS for this particular earthquake.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. But if you take a look at it, it's much bigger than anywhere else.
Oh yeah.
On the entire world map, which is substantial. So wherever you want to take that. So at this point, Keith, what do you have to say about what's going on, and what's your take on, well, everything? But let's start out with the earthquakes and how you're sort of seeing it.
Well, as far as the seismic stuff goes, I did a bit of an analysis of, as I say, the Iranian earthquake, and I think that one was of interest. Well, I say it was a bit of a cluster, but there were two earthquakes in particular. One about 6.3, another one about 6.4, and the latitudes of the earthquakes were practically dead on the same latitude as the Japanese earthquake that occurred March the 11th, 2011, last year. That was the 9.01. And I mean, I did an analysis of that in some detail on one of my YouTube videos about earthquake predictions and how it's tied into essentially the positions of the planets and the sun and the moon. And there are certain arc lengths of separation between the epicenter points of earthquakes and the positions of various celestial bodies. If the very moment an earthquake is registered, like on these databases, they're listed universal time in terms of the date, the hour, right down to the nearest second, right, when they're registered. And if you plug that information into an astronomical database and you essentially freeze the solar system and freeze the rotation of the Earth at that moment, you can essentially draw a straight line between the center of the Earth and the center of another body like the sun. And that line pierces through the surface of the Earth. So you have a ground position of coordinates for the celestial body in question. And what you tend to find is that the arc lengths over the surface of the ellipsoid Earth, not angular measures, but arc lengths that connect up those ground positions of various bodies to the epicenter points, appear to have significance in that sometimes they fit within the Earth a whole number of times, indicating a resonant fit, which is why the earthquake was triggered and occurred on that precise point. And other times they're more subtle musical frequencies and ratios. And with respect then to the Japanese earthquake and how that ties into the Iranian earthquake, well, you can also find that because the Earth's rotating on its axis, it's got a natural axis point, polar point, and an equator point, and it's almost like an amplitude point to the equator of the Earth. And not only do you find that the arc lengths that connect up the epicenter points to the ground positions of celestial bodies are significant. You also get significant latitude values, either north or south, from the equator up to or into the southern equator, say, connecting up to where the epicenter point is. So the pure latitude of the Japanese earthquake, though, was 38.322 degrees north of the equator. And that was, say, March the 11th. And what that gives you in terms of a fit is it fits in ratio-wise. Well, the ratio is, if you take, in this case, the polar circumference of the Earth, complete elliptical circumference of the Earth, and take that value and divide by the latitude value from the equator up to that Japanese one, the ratio between them is practically dead on 66 divided by 7 as a ratio. And again, it's just one of the ratios going that, in terms of the Japanese earthquake specifically, the arc length connecting up the earthquake epicenter to the sun ground position, that arc length fits into the equator of the Earth practically dead on 6 times, a whole number. And this is where the resonance effect, you see, if you've got a waveform that impinges upon a material object, a physical object, if the wavelength of the waveform, and you know how we usually model them in terms of peaks and troughs, so peak to peak or trough to trough, if that wavelength fits in to the dimensions of the physical object it impinges upon, you end up with an internal reflection of the wave. It becomes trapped within it and sets up a frozen standing wave pattern because there is a harmonic fit. And this throws the target object into an agitated state. It starts to shake. And this is why, when you look at earthquakes, you'll tend to have the positions of the sun and the moon, they'll be in special patterns. And this really is split-second timing. You'll find that you have error rates of just 1 or 2 seconds, maybe, or so, in terms of these fits of the arc lengths connecting up and fitting into the Earth, or even of ratios connecting up, a combination of arc lengths. You can have an earthquake which might have the sun, the moon, it might have Venus, all contributing bodies, and the arc lengths that play out over the surface of the Earth, essentially, might have musical ratios of 2 to 3, and or more complex ones, 25 to 17, or things like that. There'll be a very subtle pattern. This is why it's very difficult to really get to the heart of modelling them. But in the case of the Iranian earthquake, then the pure latitude value of the one just recently, and this is it was near the Tabrit region, and it was the precise date. It was the 11th of August, so it was just a few days ago now. And it was 38.322 degrees, the same latitude. So you've got the same kind of harmonic significance. And there was one that followed on from that, literally just about 12 or 13 minutes later, same latitude, but several miles away, just staggered slightly. And then we get a cluster of them. I know there's a lot of physical structures, like, say, megalithic monuments, or even advanced facilities like the Pine Gap US base or Menwith Hill. I do not find, when I look at these particular bases, that they are tied into fixed points in a geometrical system that seems to be built into our Earth as such. What I seem to find is that they are using the Earth form, and they are selecting locations. For example, the Great Pyramid, the latitude placement appears to be based on a ratio which is 10 times the difference between what is the current Earth tropical year, just over 365 days. It's 365.24218. If you divide that by 360, and the ancient Egyptians, believe that, and I too believe it was a reality that the Earth did once have 360 days per year. Well, that ratio between them is about 10.14. It seems to be that ratio defined where they positioned the latitude of the Great Pyramid in terms of the small circle circumference of the Earth at that latitude, which is about 29 degrees 58 minutes 51 seconds north. the small circle circumference there, divided just by the pure latitude arc. As I said, they are significant in their own right, the pure latitude from the equator to there. So they feel, they seem to be fitting, various structures in very precise ways with ratios tied into the planet. And another big one is the connection between Menwith Hill and Pine Gap. These are these signals intelligence bases part of the echelon matrix. Pine Gap is almost located dead centre in Australia itself, the physical landmass of Australia, near Alice Springs, I believe. And Menwith Hill is located here in England, just north of me, somewhere about 20 miles north or so, North Yorkshire. And again, if you use a very advanced Earth ellipsoid model, right, the WGS-84 model, World Geodetic System, it was in 1984, the arc length that connects up both those sites directly as a great circle arc over the Earth, over our advanced model, it has got a fixed ratio, right? It is precisely as a fraction. It's 3/8 of the Earth's equatorial circumference, right? So if you took the Earth's equatorial circumference, divide by 8, and then multiply by 3, you get that very same arc length distance between these two sites. And it's literally, we're talking error rates of several hundred feet. In the case of these two facilities, the buildings are so massive, the error rate is contained within the buildings. So it seems to me that what you're getting at, the objects seem to be sighted in very subtle ways, and they do not seem to be based upon a fixed grid on the Earth in terms of some sort of platonic solids or some kind of patterns like that. I don't see that kind of complexity. I think that they use ratios that connect up sites which are like a harmonic fit or a musical fit to the Earth itself and certain key dimensions. And this is because I believe it's tied into the physics of these facilities and what they're able to achieve. In terms of using the Earth itself, they can cause a resonant agitation. They can use the Earth as a transmitter. And in the way in which these sites, in some advanced respects, I believe that they are tied in to some